Chapter 1919. Xia Hanyang went out with a big smile. His grandfather wanted to hold a grand banquet to celebrate his high score in the college entrance examination. Xia Hanyang didn't agree at first. He only wanted to travel with Wei Wei Bai and spend money happily. But Wei Wei Bai smiled. Go ahead. After all, it's a happy occasion. Whatever his wife said, he would do. Xia Hanyang agreed immediately. And he also wanted to take advantage of this banquet to bring Wei Wei Bai to the upper class. He wanted to introduce her as his girlfriend at the banquet. Then, in another 2 years, when his finances were stable, they would get engaged. And then get married. As for Mr. Xia, that damned old man couldn't stop him. Xia Hanyang was very happy and went to prepare for the banquet. Wei Wei Bai waved her hand and said goodbye to Xia Hanyang. After he left, Wei Wei Bai simply packed up and carried a small suitcase. There was only a set of clothes in the suitcase. It was the school uniform she wore when she first came here. There were also a few books, and nothing else. The nanny wanted to say something, but stopped. In the end, she could only watch her go out of the door. Wei Wei Bai said to the system, "Find a hotel or something. Let's lie down and go back." A year's time was almost up. She could go back a few days earlier if all the tasks were completed. The system looked at the various indexes. Well, we can go back. Wei Wei Bai randomly entered a small hotel and then locked the room. She put the alley beside the bed, lay down on the bed, and slowly closed her eyes. And the system also pressed the return button. The host has completed all the tasks. Request to go back. Request successful. Countdown of 3 minutes. The system ate a small biscuit and watched Wei Wei Bai fall into an absolute deep sleep. It stuffed the biscuit into its mouth and then reached out to hold Wei Wei Bai's soul. Countdown of 3 minutes. 3 minutes. 3 minutes. The system. Waiting for 3 minutes was too long. Why was it still 3 minutes? Then, he saw a clear, thick, and glittering red line appear on the wrist of the sleeping Wei Wei Bai. The system rubbed its eyes. He looked at the red thread and used a terrifying method to bind Wei Wei Bai's soul. At the same time, the system's instruments began to confront each other. Foreign object obstructing, obliteration failed. Forcefully activating time acceleration. It was very rare for the main system's instruments to experience time acceleration. This was because it consumed too much energy. The accelerated time was to allow the host's plane to pass by quickly. It could allow the host to live a lifetime in 10 minutes. Then, without the host noticing, the soul would return to reality after a lifetime of peaceful sleep in this plane. Normally, this function would not be activated. It was only when the various functions failed and the host could not be forcibly returned. Only on the final path would time flow faster. The system saw that the sleeping Wei Wei Bai's long hair had started to grow crazily. The hair that was only at her waist had now reached her thighs. Her frail and petite body also began to grow. He had grown a little taller. Her feminine features were more mature. Like a budding flower, under the acceleration of time, it began to bloom its most beautiful side. The system heaved a sigh of relief. It should be able to safely speed up the time in this world within 10 minutes. However, the acceleration of time suddenly stopped. Acceleration for 6 years, insufficient energy, absorbed by foreign object, unable to leave the plane. Chapter 1920. Ding. Activating backup plan. Host will not be punished to spend the rest of your life in this plane, or wait for the device to repair itself and bring it back by force. The system's eyes widened, and it immediately checked the self-repair time of the device. 100 years. Damn, who could wait for 100 years? Time accelerated by 6 years. Wei Wei Bai was now 24 years old. Wouldn't she be 124 years later? What was the difference between this and spending the rest of your life in the same plane? System. No. Why did the red line suddenly appear? Wasn't it broken? It was clearly cut off by the space-time storm. What was going on? The system felt that it would have a heart attack sooner or later. Wei Wei Bai, who was in deep sleep, frowned as if she was in pain. She reached out to touch her head. This headache seems to be very intense. She looked around blankly. Am I back? Yi Yuxuan put me in such a cheap hotel this time. Did he go bankrupt? She could not be blamed for not being suspicious. Because every time she returned to the real world, her environment would change. So she did not think much about it. System. Wei Wei Bai suddenly realized that something was wrong. Wasn't this her hotel in the summer Hanyang Plain? You haven't gone back yet? Wei Wei Bai did not realize that her body had grown a little. She had long hair, so she did not realize that her hair was not normal. The system was a little nervous and quickly took out a small biscuit to calm down. Listen to me. Wei Wei Bai, I have a bad feeling. System. So, you know what's going on. Wei Wei Bai. You mean, the function of going back is damaged, so I have to stay here for the rest of my life? The system nodded with difficulty. It did not know how to explain the red line. Because it involved Yi Yuxuan, it was too difficult to explain, so it just hit it. The system quickly said, but time accelerated by 6 years. It's a good thing. After all, life was so long. A few years less was better. Wei Wei Bai was silent. She looked at the box beside her bed and finally asked with difficulty, I've slept in this hotel for 6 years. How much do I need to pay for my accommodation? The system almost choked on a biscuit. Why do the host's focus always deviate from normal people? It quickly flipped through the information. When time passes, it will automatically repair your life. You didn't sleep in a hotel for 6 years. Wei Wei Bai heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, I can afford to buy a house for 6 years. What is the life that I automatically repair? Go to a first-rate university and then continue with your postgraduate studies? She must have avoided Hanyang for the past 6 years. She was probably studying abroad. The system looked at the data. Wei Wei Bai. Finally, after a terrifying silence, the system said, for the past 6 years, you've been living in a free house, eating free food, and being surrounded by friends who speak well of you. You've lived a peaceful and happy life. Wei Wei Bai, the system said, it's like this. Since we're responding to the call to fight and sweep, we can't commit crimes, right? Wei Wei Bai slowly thought about it. Other than deceiving people, she didn't seem to have done anything that would violate the law. The system said, you stabbed that shameless stepfather to death, so you automatically repaired your life for the past 6 years. After you turned yourself in after the college entrance exam, you were charged with excessive self-defense and sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, because you turned yourself in, your sentence was reduced, and because of your good behavior, your sentence was reduced again, so you just got out of prison. Wei Wei Bai then remembered that idiotic stepfather. She had forgotten about this character. Chapter 1921. Wei Wei Bai covered her head with both hands. You're saying that now that I've been released from prison with a criminal record, no one will want me to work for the rest of my life? System. Don't worry, you have me. Wei Wei Bai. What can you do? System. You can act cute. Wei Wei Bai. Scram. Bang, bang, bang. The hotel owner knocked on the door. Time's up. Time to check in. Wei Wei Bai quickly got out of bed and put on her shoes. They were still the shoes from 6 years ago. Damn, they were a bit old. And the suitcase was much older too. It was just that nothing had changed. Wei Wei Bai carried the suitcase out, and the system told her the details of the past 6 years. There were basically no details. Other than doing handicrafts, receiving ideological education, and living a happy cohabitation life with her prison mates. Then she could go out every day. When she woke up in the hotel just now, it was the first day she was released from prison, and then she used the last of her money to stay in a hotel for a day. If she didn't have a job, she would starve to death. Wait, where was Hanyang? Wei Wei Bai just asked the system when a newspaper flew from the ground and stuck to her face. Her sharp eyes caught sight of Hanyang's name on the headlines of the newspaper. She picked it up and saw that it was the new head of the Xia enterprise, the youngest and most powerful successor of the family business in the history of the Xia family. Old Master Xia retired. Hanyang successfully succeeded this year and used cold and neat methods to sweep away all obstacles. He pulled the enterprise to new heights. Hanyang in the newspaper. It was obvious that the photo was taken in a hurry. He walked out of the elevator, followed by a few elites. All of them were in suits. Xia Hanyang also wore a formal suit, a black suit jacket wrapped around his perfect model figure. His face had long lost the youthfulness of a teenager, and there was no lively enthusiasm. Instead, it was cold and strong. His eyes looked at the camera casually, as sharp and cold as an eagle's. It was full of an aura that made people tremble. Wei Bai silently looked away, feeling that Xia Hanyang had turned from a little wolf dog into a big demon king. The contrast was a little too big. She was not used to the fact that her world had been turned upside down after just one night of sleep. The system said, ever since the male lead started working hard, he's basically killing everyone he meets. Whoever gets in his way, he'll kill them. We should avoid him. Wei Bai trembled. She felt that something was wrong with the system's words. She finally remembered her parting gift. Did he see the video? The system replied, as time passed, he saw it in the 3rd month. Wei Bai said, I thought old master would be able to hide for a little longer. After all, her words were too hurtful. Old Master Xia doted on his grandson so much that he definitely didn't want Xia Hanyang to see the surveillance video. The system said, the male lead couldn't find you, so he went on a hunger strike and committed suicide. He didn't do it on purpose, he just couldn't take it and broke down. Xia Hanyang was mentally ill. After Wei Bai left, he couldn't find her and went crazy. As Wei Bai listened, she felt her heart tighten a little. The image of the little wolfhound starving to death was very strong, and it attacked him. The system said, after he saw the surveillance video, he shut himself up for a week before he finally pulled himself together. After that, he had another dream. Wei Bai asked, what dream? That idiot Xia worked so hard to pull himself together. He still had a bright future and a dream. It sounded like he was still very passionate. The system said, to find you and cut you into pieces. Wei Bai was speechless. This dream, it was poisonous. The system said, don't doubt me. Your picture is on the dart plate. He shoots darts every day. Download the at https://m.sashu.com// to make it easier for you to read it next time. You can click save at the bottom to record this chapter. Chapter 1922. Wei Bai, why does my face hurt? Did I get hit by a dart? The system said, he's learning boxing. He accidentally punched and kicked the sandbag. Oh right, your picture is printed on the outside of the sandbag. Wei Bai, damn, that's too cruel. Just hearing it sounds like my bones will break. The system said, he's still. Wei Bai said, stop, run. Xia Hanyang was treating her as an enemy. If she didn't run away now, she would probably lose her life if she was caught. Plus, the character was annoying. She was dead, but Xia Hanyang wasn't dead yet. She had to become a spirit behind him and follow him until he died. The system said, wait, I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want to hear first? Wei Bai said, both of them, no first or last. The system said, the male lead's favorability is still at 95. Wei Bai's eyes lit up. Good news. The favorability had only decreased by 5 because she had completed the mission. No matter how much the favorability changed, it had nothing to do with her. But at least when Xia Hanyang wanted to kill her, she could at least cry a little and live. The system said, the bad news is that his hatred towards you is still at 95. Wei Bai said, what does 95 mean? The system said, it means that his current feelings towards you are very likely to be due to strong love and hatred. He will kill you and make you into a specimen to accompany him. Wei Bai said, what's the earliest flight out of this country? Let's go abroad. As long as they didn't meet Xia Hanyang. Even Ethelbia had to go. The system said, I'll check, but you don't have money. Wei Bai said, not only do I not have money, my hair is too long. Nowadays, we have to save money on shampoo, so I have to cut it short. Although time had passed, she had a life plan. But she neglected the details. She had to cut her hair in prison. Her hair was never cut. The system said, Your hair is so long. It can be sold for money. Wei Bai, that's true. Tomorrow's meal is settled, haha. The host and the system, these two idiots, laughed miserably. Because she was too poor, Wei Bai carried her school uniform and a few books back to the old house. It was the old house in the slum where she lived before she met Xia Hanyang. The house felt like it was going to collapse. Because of the special location, there was no demolition, but there were fewer people. It was similar to Ghost City. Wei Bai had no choice. Her criminal record had cut off her path to work. She could only work part-time tomorrow. However, he had to settle down first. Without a water heater, Wei Bai could only carry a bucket of water and put it on the shabby balcony to wash her hair. Below the little sun terrace was the dilapidated and muddy road of the slums. Wei Bai bent down to wash her hair. The system chatted with her. I'll go to the supermarket to see if there's anything that can improve your luck. Otherwise, it would be difficult to have a smooth life with a criminal record. Wei Bai, yes, but don't consider those with more than 50 HP. The system nodded, opened the supermarket shelves, and began to choose. While the host and the system were extremely careless. A black car quickly drove over from the muddy road. Xia Hanyang was wearing a phone headset. There's a charity party tonight. Secretary Chun will be by your side the whole time. Tomorrow, there's an international video conference at 7 o'clock. Rest for an hour at 9 o'clock, and there's an internal meeting at 10 o'clock. He was expressionless, and his eyes were terrifyingly cold. Send tomorrow's itinerary to my mailbox before 11 o'clock tonight. After saying that, he took off the phone headset and threw it aside. Every time this time, he would be irritated and uncomfortable. Chapter 1923. It was another year and 6 months. She had been missing for 6 years. Thinking of this, Xia Hanyang clenched his teeth so hard that they bled. He stepped on the brakes and stopped the car. Seeing that his car was muddy, he rubbed his temples hard. He came here again. These days, he saw reports that the progress of the search had been stagnant. He was almost crazy, wandering around the old school. After a while, he actually came to this place. This was Wei Bai's nightmare. Was he crazy? She couldn't have come here, no matter where she went. Xia Hanyang was about to turn the car around. Without thinking much, he looked up and glanced at the old building. His peripheral vision swayed. Without thinking much, he was about to turn the car around. Suddenly, he stepped on the brakes hard. He clung to the car window and stared at the familiar house and the familiar figure. He couldn't see her appearance clearly from the short balcony. He could only see her beautiful outline as she bent down to wash her hair. Then he saw her get up, take a towel, and slowly dry her long hair. Then she poured the water with some effort. Xia Hanyang felt as if his brain had been split. He had been looking for her for 6 years. She had been missing for 6 years. Suddenly, she broke into his cold life again. Was he dreaming? Xia Hanyang burst out with unimaginable strength. Afraid that she would run away, he kicked the car door open and ran into the corridor. He finally rushed to the old door. His brain was full of anger. Without thinking, he kicked the door and roared, Wei Bai, get out here. If you have the guts to lie to me, don't run away." This roar was filled with resentment, fury, and pain that was twisted and explosive. And grievance. Wei Bai and the system inside the door. Xia Hanyang threw caution to the wind and kicked the door hard. He didn't give himself a chance to think. He was too uncomfortable. He was afraid that he was dreaming. He was afraid that once he stopped, he would see the empty and lifeless ghost building. The beautiful outline that flashed by just now was just his mental illness. He had had enough. He had had enough of the desperate and helpless search. He hated her coldness. He hated that she played him like a game. When he was ruined, she took the money and left. Because she didn't like him. Therefore, he would rather ask for 10 million. She didn't want a rich son-in-law like him, who was worth tens of billions. Was it because she saw him that she was so annoyed that she didn't even want to eat? In her heart, he was worse than a toy. But he still searched for her like a madman, hating and loving her. After tormenting him for 6 years, there were so many times that he was on the verge of collapse. If it wasn't for his stubbornness, he would have jumped into the sea. Wei Bai, I've had enough of this name. He had had enough of this woman disappearing. She clearly didn't love him. Every time she thought of him, she was being cheap. But he was being cheap all the time. Wei Bai sees that the door has been kicked out of shape. This explosive force and strength are several times more terrible than that of Xia Hanyang in his teens. Wei Bai quickly said, "What should we do? Where should we hide?" It was obvious that Xia Hanyang was here to kill. She was about to become the spirit behind him. The system said, calm down. I'll buy a luck charm." Just as it finished speaking, the door was kicked open with a bang. Wei Bai's hands trembled, dropping the shampoo in her hand. The system's hands also trembled, pressing the wrong button. The luck charm turned into a discount bag of potato chips. I haven't eaten grape-flavored potato chips yet. The system hugged the potato chips. Wait, where's the luck charm? Xia Hanyang stood at the door in a daze. Wei Bai stands beside the shabby sofa, wearing an old and loose school uniform and yellow sneakers. Her ankles were shining white. Her black hair falls to her thighs, water droplets dripping from the ends of her hair to the ground. She seemed to be a little surprised and looked at him blankly. Her eyes were still hazy. Time has added a mature beauty to her face. But more than that, her temperament has not changed at all. She was still quiet with a careless indifference. Xia Hanyang staggered a few steps and finally came to his senses. He walked in step by step. His aura was ferocious, and his eyes were red as he stared at her. Wei Bai was a little slow to react, because she felt that she had only been away for 2 days. But Xia Hanyang changed from a well-behaved little wolf dog to a ferocious predator. He was much taller and broader. The contrast was so big that she couldn't adjust her brain. The figure of an adult male was too oppressive, like a terrible shadow hanging over her head. Wei Bai couldn't help but step back. Xia Hanyang seemed to be stung, and his speed suddenly increased. He was in front of her in an instant, and his hands clutched her neck tightly. Wei Bai, I'm going to kill you. Wei Bai, life was too miserable. She had just been released from prison, and now she had to face a murder case. This world was not easy at all. The / you can see it when you open the bookshelf next time. If you like the Chapter 1924. The man's hand was very hot, like fire. It was so hot that Wei Bai felt a little uncomfortable. His eyes were crazy and ruthless. He was like an injured lone wolf who had no way out and wanted to die together with her. He was so strong that he choked her comforting words back. Wei Bai staggered a few steps back and hit the sofa leg. Her whole body fell backward. Xia Hanyang thought that she was going to escape. His well-defined fingers became stronger. For a moment, Wei Bai felt that Xia Hanyang really wanted to strangle her to death. After strangling her to death, would he make her into a specimen? Thinking of the system's words, she shivered and immediately struggled. Xia Hanyang saw that she was in pain. His fingers were trembling, and his eyes flashed with hesitation. But her struggle only served to ignite his dangerous anger. He had nowhere to vent the pain that had accumulated over the past 6 years. So many times, when he was in so much pain, he could only desperately think of how to kill her after finding her. No one could play with him like that. He was like a fool, happily circling around her. Every time he thought of it, those sweet scenes became a great irony. She calmly compared her face to the video and said that she didn't like him. He didn't dare to think about it. In hindsight, she was indeed indifferent to him. She was more passionate about learning than he was. At that time, did she look down on him every time she saw him circling around her like a dog? She changed him and made him learn. It wasn't for his own good. It was just a game. He was a bootlicker that she had successfully changed. She must have been very happy. After all, she had turned Xia Hanyang into a well-behaved dog who desperately gnawed at the textbooks he didn't like and studied the questions he didn't like. He was so arrogant and reckless at that time. For her, He changed everything. It didn't matter even if he became a good-for-nothing, because he liked her too much. Even to the extent that the night she gave herself to him, he restrained all of his violent side and used a sincere and humble attitude to love her. But to her it was nothing. She had never been moved. She could give her body to a man she didn't like without a care. In these 6 years, did she have many men? Did she trick a bunch of dogs to work for her again? Wei Wei Bai was completely overwhelmed by his strength. She tripped and fell onto the sofa. He used even more strength to strangle her to death. Sure enough, reincarnation was part of the heavenly Tao. He felt that if he cheated too much, the victim's family would kill him. If she had known that she couldn't leave this damned plane, she would have insisted that she loved him even if old Master Xia wanted to drown her in the sea. He was going to pay for this with his life. Wei Wei Bai's thin fingernails could only leave a shallow mark on the back of his hand where veins were bulging. She said to the system, "I might need a spirit on my back." The system immediately bought the lucky charm again. "I bought the charm. It's fine. The charm will use the most reasonable and logical method to save you." The charm was a one-time use item that only gave 15 HP. But to be able to push a fatal crisis towards a less fatal direction. And it would definitely be realized in a realistic and logical way. This was the supermarket's most popular product for the poor this year. With the system's help, Wei Wei Bai immediately felt relieved. Her eyes were filled with tears, biological tears that were pinched out. Her face was pale, and her body was pressed down by him without any resistance. Xia Hanyang's angry face appeared in her beautiful watery eyes. He looked like a psychopathic and crazy murderer. Chapter 1925. Xia Hanyang paused, and his heart was torn apart. His lips trembled, and he wanted to strangle her to end all troubles. He didn't want her to see his weakness. But in the end, he couldn't bear it. He gritted his teeth and said, "Wei Wei Bai, do you regret it? Do you regret abandoning me?" She was like a resentful woman who had been abandoned by a heartless man. What he thought about every day was her regret. She didn't like him, so she abandoned him. Did she regret it? This kind of laughable mentality had almost turned him into a demon. Wei Wei Bai wanted to say that she regretted it, but her neck was about to be broken by Xia Hanyang. Even if this idiot moved his hand 0.1 centimeters away, she would still say that she regretted it. After so many years, he had become irritable, strong, and ruthless. The only thing that remained unchanged was his IQ. He was a mad husky, still a husky. But Wei Wei Bai's contemptuous eyes were seen by the sensitive Xia Hanyang, and she didn't regret it at all. Xia Hanyang's face turned livid, and his fingers trembled violently. Finally, he couldn't bear to strangle her. His fingers were just about to leave her. Suddenly, a creaking sound came from above. The old fan was suddenly cut off. It fell on their heads. Xia Hanyang didn't think much and rolled to the side with Wei Wei Bai in his arms. Wei Wei Bai was strangled, and Xia Hanyang once again pressed down on her. The weight of an adult man could really cause problems for a person. She tasted something sweet in her throat, and blood surged up. She couldn't help gasping in a low voice, and a few traces of blood overflowed from her lips. She wiped the corners of her mouth and saw the blood on her fingertips. Was this an internal injury caused by Xia Hanyang? The system saw that the charm was almost burned out. This charm was unscrupulous to force the plot to happen. If the fan fell down, it would kill someone. Although it didn't hit her, Wei Wei Bai was also pressed down by Xia Hanyang's weight. Xia Hanyang looked up and saw the blood on her mouth. His pupils constricted, and he suddenly got up and easily picked her up. Then he ran out. His stamina was really amazing. Bai Weiwei was really speechless. When she reached the stairs, she quickly adjusted her mood and said in a painful and hesitant voice, "Xia Hanyang." Xia Hanyang was irritated and angry. His anger was mixed with joy that he was unwilling to admit. He was extremely conflicted. When he heard her voice, he immediately roared, "Shut up if you don't want to die. I want to strangle you to death every time I hear your voice." Wei Wei Bai, shut up. A resentful man was not to be trifled with. 2 batches of doctors came to the hospital. The person who came later was an old Chinese medicine doctor. He looked at the bruise on Wei Wei Bai's neck and looked at it for a while before leaving. After a while, Xia Hanyang stood at the door and stared at her gloomily. She hadn't changed out of her school uniform. Just like the first time he saw her, she was also like this. He had a frail figure, long hair, and a loose old school uniform. He was immediately pulled into that period of time. His time in school was sweet when it was related to her. And all of this came to an abrupt end after the college entrance examination. He was never willing to recall how he felt when he came back and saw an empty house. It was too painful. Xia Hanyang thought of the words of the old Chinese medicine doctor. Her vital energy and blood were weak, her foundation was deficient, and her heart was exhausted. That was why her blood was congested and she vomited due to emotional fluctuations. He tried his best to take care of her body. After she left him, she was carefree. She didn't care about her body at all. Chapter 1926. She doesn't care about what he likes? Xia Hanyang smiled sarcastically and slowly walked to the sofa and sat down. He fiercely suppressed his furious emotions. He was no longer the idiot from 6 years ago who would be affected by her emotions and emotions. Xia Hanyang was wearing a black tailored suit. Although it was a little messy, it did not affect his indifferent temperament. He looked at Wei Wei Bai coldly. The more he cared, the scarier his expression was. Wei Wei Bai felt that Xia Wolfdog's expression was not very good. She was very sensible and did not say anything. Now Xia Hanyang was full of murderous intent when he saw her. She understood that he must have thought of all kinds of plans to kill her in the past few days after their reunion. So Wei Wei Bai carefully picked up the cup next to her. She was a little thirsty and wanted to drink some water to calm down. If she had money, she could go abroad with the system and have fun. Then everything would be fine. Now she was penniless and didn't even have money to take a taxi. Xia Hanyang's eyes fell on her hands, her clothes, and her posture of slowly drinking water. Then he suddenly snorted coldly. Why? You've been so down and out these years. After leaving me, did you find that you're useless? What's the use of good grades? Without money, you're still a low-class person in society. Wei Wei Bai did not say anything and let Xia Hanyang vent. After all, it was not a good time to provoke him. Xia Hanyang looked at her indifferent face, as if she didn't care what he said at all. He clenched his fingers and his round nails pierced into his flesh. He didn't feel the pain even if he was bleeding. Xia Hanyang forced himself to calm down. Wasn't she ruthless? He should be more ruthless than her. He should let her know that without him, she could only live a miserable life. Xia Hanyang crossed his slender legs, and his eyes were so cold that they were about to emit black gas. Did you regret taking 10 million yuan that year? You can cheat more money before you leave. Now you know how much money is. Wei Wei Bai paused and then nodded slowly. Well, it was good to be rich. If only she had cashed the check at that time. Now, the check was probably worthless. She was so poor that she was even planning to sell her hair. Xia Hanyang said money just to humiliate her. However, Wei Wei Bai nodded calmly. She didn't feel humiliated at all. Instead, she seemed to agree with what he said. Xia Hanyang. Wei Wei Bai drank her water silently. She didn't know if she would be forgiven if she rushed over to kiss him now. I don't think so. Xia Hanyang is not that easy to fool. After all, he had been fooled by her once. Xia Hanyang breathed heavily and wanted to smash the cup in Wei Wei Bai's hand. It had been 6 years, and he had thought about the scene of their meeting many times. But not like this. She looked at the glass of water and didn't look at him. Xia Hanyang felt extremely disappointed. He gritted his teeth. He had a lot of plans in his mind to take revenge on her. But when he really encountered it, his mind went blank. He could only observe her in fear and trepidation to see if she still had any feelings for him and if she had any regrets. But when he realized that her eyes were already cold and detached, he felt that he was simply a joke. Xia Hanyang suddenly stood up. He stretched out his hand and straightened his collar stiffly. He forced himself to maintain the last bit of dignity as a man and looked at Wei Wei Bai coldly. Then he suddenly laughed sarcastically. Wei Wei Bai, I want to tell you that I have no feelings for you at all. I have a lot of women like you. Wei Wei Bai silently looked at the favorability of 95. Then she was relieved and continued to drink water. Download the at https://m Sashu. COMT. Chapter 1927. It was better to let Xia Hanyang scold her than to strangle her to death, because he suddenly hated her. Xia Hanyang saw that she didn't respond at all. He finally knew that the last trace of expectation was gone. Xia Hanyang turned around fiercely. He ordered himself coldly that he couldn't have any feelings for her. Then he immediately went out. If he didn't go out, he would explode. Walking out of the door and turning into the corridor, he suddenly sat down on the chair. His fingers were still trembling. He really found her. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but reach out and cover his face. He was crazy. He actually felt happy. When he saw her, his anger was actually just to cover up his cheap joy. Xia Hanyang had been a zombie for 6 years. Only today could he feel the excitement of the physical carnival. He couldn't lie to himself. He wanted to hug her, kiss her, and cry to her. He hated that he was still thinking about Wei Wei Bai like a loser. But he couldn't help being excited. Xia Hanyang kept telling himself that he couldn't be good to her. He couldn't be good to her anymore. She was just a liar. Xia Hanyang tried his best to make himself think about work. But the work that used to give him peace was useless at this time. Xia Hanyang wanted to go back to the ward. Only she could comfort the 6 years of longing and resentment. He tried to sit for a long time before he struggled to get up. He couldn't control himself and walked towards the ward. Suddenly, the secretary's voice came from behind. President Xia, tonight's charity party is about to start. Bring me the blue and white porcelain vase from the Qing dynasty. Xia Hanyang remembered that the secretary came to the hospital just to remind him about work. He couldn't help saying, "Cancel tonight's schedule." The secretary hesitated for a moment. "But the vase," Xia Hanyang said coldly. "Deal with it yourself." Then, he couldn't wait to run to the door of the ward. He suppressed his heavy breathing and rubbed his face hard to maintain a cold expression. Then he opened the door and went in. But there was no one in the ward. Xia Hanyang stood there for a few seconds before he rushed into the ward and lifted the thin sheet. Of course, Wei Wei Bai couldn't be there. She left again? Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a moment and then suddenly shouted, "Wei Wei Bai, I'm going to kill you." In the bathroom, Wei Wei Bai, who had just finished using the toilet, opened the door. Xia Hanyang shouted that he wanted to kill her. Wei Wei Bai said to the system, "Sai, I cheated other people's feelings and now they want me to pay with my life." The system said, "He's doing something immoral after all. Why don't you be the spirit behind him?" The two of them, Su Tong and Su Tong, were really immoral. Therefore, the system didn't have the face to say that they were good people. These words were usually said by the host himself. Xia Hanyang heard the door open and saw Wei Wei Bai standing at the door. She seemed to be frightened. His hands were still waving, and he looked like he was going to eat someone. When he saw Wei Wei Bai suddenly appear, he realized that she had not left. Xia Hanyang's hands paused in the air for a long time before he slowly withdrew them. He asked an extremely stupid question. "Where did you go?" Wei Wei Bai was silent for a while before she answered. "Bathroom." Xia Hanyang snorted. "I'm asking you, where are you going after you leave the hospital?" Wei Wei Bai frowned and said, "I want to go." Xia Hanyang said, "Where you want to go has nothing to do with me." Wei Wei Bai, the little wolf dog, was finally going to humiliate her and take revenge on her? His tone was so aggressive. Download the at https://m Sashu. Com button at the bottom to record this chapter. Chapter 1928. Xia Hanyang suddenly called in the secretary, who was standing at the door with a helpless expression. He asked deliberately, "I'm going to the charity party tonight, right?" The secretary nodded. "I'll cancel it." Xia Hanyang glared at him coldly. "Why cancel it?" "This is an important party to promote my recent project of hundreds of millions of yuan." He emphasized the words hundreds of millions and deliberately glanced at Wei Wei Bai. There was still no response. Xia Hanyang gritted his teeth and said, "How much was the blue and white porcelain vase I bought?" "I forgot." The secretary immediately said, "More than 5 million, Mr. Xia." Xia Hanyang said, "You remembered wrong. It was 50 million. The secretary was speechless. The price suddenly increased tenfold. He couldn't bear it. Xia Hanyang said, "Show me the vase. If it's broken, I'll compensate you tenfold." The secretary quickly handed over the gift box with the vase, for fear of being blackmailed. Xia Hanyang pretended to take it, then took out a beautiful blue and white porcelain vase and threw it away. He suddenly said, "You must have lived a poor life these years. You haven't seen such a beautiful vase, right? I'll show it to you." After that, he gave the vase to Wei Bai. Wei Bai held the vase, feeling that there was something wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Xia Hanyang saw that she was holding a blue and white porcelain vase and seemed to be very confused. He suddenly laughed sinisterly and slapped the bottle with his hand. His strength was terrifying. When Wei Bai saw his hand coming, she instinctively wanted to step back. However, Xia Hanyang had been planning for a long time. He quickly stepped forward, grabbed her hand, and forced her to let go of the vase. The vase fell down at once. The secretary rushed over, rolled to the ground, and stretched out his hands to catch the vase. 5 million yuan. After he caught it, he immediately looked up with a smile and was about to take credit. However, he saw Xia Hanyang glaring at him gloomily, as if he was going to exterminate his whole family. Then Xia Hanyang quickly raised his foot and kicked the vase out of the secretary's hand. The vase hit the ground and broke. Wei Bai and the secretary had the same expression. He had a puzzled look on his face, but he felt that there was a conspiracy going on. Xia Hanyang clasped her hand. Her wrist was slender, soft and slightly cold, which made his heart twitch. Then, without batting an eyelid, he rubbed her wrist with his fingers. Like a thirsty patient craving for a little bit of skin warmth, he stole it carefully and greedily. Wei Bai felt that her wrist was a little itchy and she wanted to pull it back. Xia Hanyang sneered, "My bottle is broken." Wei Bai replied calmly, "Oh." Xia Hanyang looked regretful. 50 million. Wei Bai, I feel like there's a hidden meaning in his words. Xia Hanyang said, "You can't afford it." Wei Bai finally realized that she had been blackmailed. Every time, she was the one who tried to blackmail others. She was not used to it when others suddenly tried to blackmail her. Xia Hanyang finally showed his ferocious fangs. "You broke my bottle. I don't need you to pay me back 10 times, but 5 times will do. 250 million. Pay me back immediately." Wei Bai was silent for a moment. So this was her life after 6 years of hibernation. She was in prison, was murdered, and was blackmailed to claim 250 million. She felt a little miserable. Wei Bai frowned. "You are the one who broke the bottle." Xia Hanyang raised his eyelids, revealing his sinister look. "Who saw it? You are the one who broke the bottle. Pay me back." Wei Bai looked at the secretary. Xia Hanyang also looked at the secretary. The secretary was shocked. Then he suddenly covered his eyes. "I've been suffering from heat stroke recently. I didn't see anything." Wei Bai finally said in a low voice, "Xia Hanyang, what do you want?" He probably thought of a way to take revenge on her. Xia Hanyang was still holding her wrist. He approached her and stared at her pale but gentle face. Her breath was still like strawberry-flavored poison. She lured him into eternal damnation. Xia Hanyang heard his incomparably cold voice ring out. "Can't afford it? Wei Bai." He revealed a devilish smile. "Then I'll sell myself." Chapter 1929. Then I'll sell myself. Ba ba ba. Wei Bai felt that her ability to control her emotions had regressed. Because after hearing this sentence, she looked at Xia Hanyang's face that was pretending to be cold and ruthless. She trembled and tried to hold back her laughter. She couldn't laugh. She couldn't laugh. The system couldn't help it. With a poof, the biscuits flew out. Ha ha ha, I'm dying of laughter. What kind of stupid line is this? Wei Wei Bai struggled to maintain a stiff expression, and her voice trembled. Sell myself. Xia Hanyang thought that she was scared. Anyone would be scared if they suddenly owed a few 100 million yuan. He kicked the secretary beside him. Go and get the contract. You have to sign it. Contract, sell yourself. The domineering CEO's contract to sell himself to his lover. She felt that such a CEO's novel would be too old-fashioned to sell. Wei Wei Bai felt that she should cooperate with him. After all, such a stupid plot was rare. The mentally retarded tyrant was always happier. Wei Wei Bai's sullen feeling after waking up disappeared with a laugh. She adjusted her expression and suddenly grabbed Xia Hanyang's cuff. Her fingertips turned white, and there was a trace of incredulity in her eyes. Xia Hanyang, you're so ruthless for a relationship when you were young. You weren't so cold before. Xia Hanyang felt the strength of her fingertips. Her fingertips rubbed against the beautiful dark gold cufflinks on his cuff. Her fingertips were as fragile as snowflakes that could melt at any time. He resisted the urge to hold her fingers. He flung them away fiercely and said with a cold face, You're wrong. I used to be so vengeful. I wanted to kill you when I saw you. It's too easy for you to sell yourself. Bai Weiwei's delicate brows furrowed, her expression unsightly. Sell yourself? I don't know if I'm worth 250 million yuan. Even if you cut me open, my organs won't be worth so much money. Xia Hanyang's eyes turned cold. Who wants your organs? Wei Wei Bai looked innocent. Otherwise, why do you want me to sell myself? Xia Hanyang. Wei Wei Bai took a step forward and approached him. Her face was calm and puzzled. Could it be that you want me to do something else? Xia Hanyang opened his mouth, thinking that he could be shameless enough to shout. Selling your body to serve me? As my slave, you are not allowed to run, and only listen to me. The meaning of these words was too dirty. For a moment, Xia Hanyang looked at Wei Wei Bai with real doubts in his eyes and couldn't say anything. The secretary had already brought the contract paper over. He said loudly, Director Xia, what's the content of the contract to print? Xia Hanyang woke up with a start. Looking at the calm and ignorant Wei Wei Bai, he suddenly got angry. Did she think that he was still a teenage idiot? He had many tricks up his sleeve now. The Xia family was his. No one could suppress him anymore. Xia Hanyang sneered, grabbed her arm, pressed her on the bed, and then took the contract. It was still blank. He pointed to the signature space at the bottom. Don't worry about what I'm selling myself for. Just give me your autograph. Xia Hanyang stuffed the pen in his pocket into her finger. Then he held her wrist and forced her to sign. Wei Wei Bai struggled and looked at the blank contract paper. This contract was more terrible than selling herself. It was blank. If Xia Hanyang wrote that she should bark like a dog every day, would she really bark? She guessed that after being deceived by her, his mentality was distorted. Who knew how perverted he had been in the past few years? Download the at https://m/sashu.com at the bottom to record this reading record. Chapter 1930. So Wei Wei Bai didn't sign her name and even said coldly, Xia Hanyang, don't go too far. Feelings can't be forced. Back then, we just broke up because we were in a relationship. Why are you so persistent? Can't we live our own lives if we don't meet in the future? Xia Hanyang was heartbroken when he heard this. Live their own lives. Only Wei Wei Bai was living well. He was living a life worse than death. All these years, she had been living a carefree life. He didn't know how she squandered the 10 million yuan. She didn't even have a cent left and even made herself like this. He refused to admit that he saw her so down and out. He didn't feel happy at all. There was only anger and irritation in his heart. He wanted her to live a miserable life and regret it, but when he saw her miserable, his heart ached. His heart ached. He couldn't bear to see her live a life worse than a pig or a dog. That feeling was like his most cherished treasure being thrown into the mud and trampled on at will. So Xia Hanyang's expression became ruthless and irritable. Live well. Your life is too down and out. I let you eat and drink well, but I won't let you sell your organs, and I won't let you starve. Wouldn't your life be better? Wei Wei Bai reacted. Little lover? She felt that this name was a little familiar. Wasn't this the name that Xia Hanyang and his group called the women they played with casually? She heard that after playing with them, they would give them money, houses, and cars. It sounded good. Cough, cough. Wei Wei Bai stopped such immoral thoughts. Xia Hanyang snorted.
Why?
Be my little lover, and I'll let you live a life of luxury. Compared to you, who don't even have a pair of new shoes now, that life is like heaven and earth. Coercion and temptation. Xia Hanyang felt that his emotions were out of control. He couldn't let her run away. He could only find something to tie her up, to make himself feel at ease. If she hadn't gone to the bathroom just now and had run out of the hospital directly, she would have disappeared for 8 to 10 years. He would have gone crazy if he continued to look for her in despair. He didn't want to admit it, but when they met again, he had resentment, shame, and pain for her. But more than that, it was a sick and twisted possessiveness. The moment he saw her, he was moved and delighted, intertwining into a kind of self-disdain and redemption. He fell into her cold love trap. He couldn't be any more dead. There was no way he could come back to life. Only by becoming a terrifying wraith and pestering her would he be able to feel like a living human. He felt that he was so cheap that he couldn't be saved. Sign it. Otherwise, don't even think about leaving this place. Xia Hanyang didn't even bother to tempt her. He held her hand tightly and was about to sign his name on the column. Wei Wei Bai refused to sign her name. Instead, she became a little anxious. Xia Hanyang, you're no different from a bully. Besides, this kind of contract has no legal effect. There is no time limit and there are no specific rules set by both parties, Xia Hanyang said. You don't have to worry about that. You just need to sign it. My team of lawyers will make it legally effective. If it wasn't for the fact that it didn't fit her character, Wei Wei Bai would have signed it. Because Xia Hanyang was holding her hand too tightly, her fingers were numb. Wei Wei Bai looked up at the secretary and said in a clear and calm voice, Sir, can you help me call the police? Your boss is illegally imprisoning me. He even threatened me and made me sign an unreasonable contract. By the way, he's also blackmailing me. Secretary. The fast. Chapter 1931. His boss was forcing a good girl into prostitution. What should he do? Morality and life were in a tug-of-war. Xia Hanyang looked up at his secretary. Bring me the ink pad. He didn't want to sign his name, but his fingerprint was fine too. The secretary was speechless. His boss was forcing him into prostitution. Conscience and interests were in a tug-of-war. The secretary wanted to cry. He was just an employee. He felt like he had entered a mafia group. In the end, the secretary obediently brought the ink pad and retreated to a corner, pretending that he hadn't seen anything. After all, his eyesight wasn't very good, so he didn't see anything. Then Bai Weiwei watched helplessly as her fingerprints fell to the signature area. After so many years, Xia Hanyang had indeed grown. The bully's methods were more skillful. Xia Hanyang saw that the contract was signed, then looked up and revealed a nasty smile. How long is the contract? 250 million. Do you know how much it is? It's enough to buy you 100 lifetimes. She was delusional to think that the contract had a time limit. It didn't exist. A lifetime was too short. Xia Hanyang put away the contract, then said to his secretary, Call my bodyguards and nannies. Come to the hospital to pack up and go home. With that, he suddenly lowered his head, held her face firmly, and kissed her hard. His attitude showed that he was treating her as his own. There was no trace of respect or shyness, only domineering strength. Then he stared at Wei Wei Bai's hazy eyes. You're mine in the future. Don't think about going anywhere until you pay off your debt. The attitude of a creditor was high and mighty. Wei Wei Bai calmly wiped her lips, then suddenly lay on the bed and covered herself with a quilt. She said coldly, I'm tired. Xia Hanyang wanted to reach out and pull her up. Other people's little lovers were all sucking up to their sugar daddies. How could there be such a lazy lover? But when he saw the tired look on her face, his fingers stiffly tugged at the quilt, but in the end, he covered her with the quilt. Then he took a few steps back. Have a good rest. If your health is too bad now, I'll suffer a loss. With that said, he pointed at his secretary. The two of them went out. After they went out, Bai Weiwei and the system started to muffled laughter. Weiwei Bai, selling yourself, haha. What era is this melodramatic drama? The system said, so this is the love-hate relationship between the contract lover and the dumb husky male lead? Ha ha ha. Weiwei Bai said, we don't have to sell our hair for the time being. The system replied, yeah, but you'll have a sugar daddy in the future. Are you going to be a little white flower again? Weiwei Bai was as calm as the wind. No, I don't think Xia Hanyang will do anything even if I become a spirit. His most lethal move right now was to kiss her. Furthermore, when he kissed her, the fingers that were cupping her face were twitching nervously. It wasn't that easy to pretend to be a domineering CEO. At least, Xia Hanyang was too happy to be a bully. The system said, I thought you would act pitiful and say that you went to jail for the sake of your morals. You said you didn't like him because you didn't want to implicate him. Weiwei Bai's shamelessness was well known. How could she let go of the opportunity to act pitiful? Weiwei Bai said, I didn't have time to say it when I was strangled, and now it won't have much effect. He'll still hate me. 6 years. It was no longer a ravine that could be erased by her going to jail. Xia Hanyang's heart was too empty. Weiwei Bai had seen Xia Hanyang's extreme feelings for her during the time she spent with Xiangyu. While he liked her, he also had a twisted hatred. / Chapter 1932. Back then, the surveillance video did not make Xia Hanyang so desperate. After all, Xia Hanyang was very optimistic and self-confident. Even if she said that she did not like him once. He also had 10,000 reasons to think that she was coerced. Old Master Xia even said in the surveillance video that he would send her to prison. So back then, Xia Hanyang knew that she did not like him. Not only because of the surveillance video. It was because he grew up, his mind was clear, and he found the truth himself. The love of a teenager was crazy and confused. She made a simple affirmation. He could imagine that she liked him. But a person could not always be a teenager. When Xia Hanyang woke up and thought about it, he knew that she did not like him. Because to complete the side mission, she almost gave up on the main mission. So her so-called liking was full of loopholes. Weiwei Bai recalled the process of her strategy and could not help but say, Xia Hanyang hates me for not liking him, not for leaving him. So even if she said that she was in prison, besides getting a little sympathy, it would not help her situation much. The system could not help but sympathize and said, so don't leave. Try again, and let him be happy. It sympathized with Xia Hanyang's miserable situation. Of course, the system knew that as long as Weiwei Bai could not leave the plane of the obsessed male protagonist, she could not get rid of him no matter where she went. Weiwei Bai nodded. This may be the best way now. I will try again, and let him believe that I love him. Once Xia Hanyang felt love, he would definitely become a little mutt. Of course, the best way was to leave Xia Hanyang and take the money to live freely abroad. The result was that once Xia Hanyang caught her, he would not let her go and would die with her. So Weiwei Bai chose to stay for the time being. The system said, and you don't have to live on the streets. You will have a stable life in the future. Treat the male protagonist better. After all, he is a meal ticket. Weiwei Bai said, got it. I will treat him better. Then the host and the system, who had plotted against each other, could not help but laugh out loud. Xia Hanyang's action was very powerful. He was afraid that Weiwei Bai would disappear. After confirming that Weiwei Bai was in good condition, he immediately took her home. Weiwei Bai realized that the house had changed. Maybe it was because Xia Hanyang had to work in a building in the city's business district for a long time. Therefore, the house was located in the city center and was very close to the business district. The housing prices here were sky-high. It was estimated that this floor of the apartment would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a very modern and cool decoration style. Xia Hanyang's swift and decisive character was displayed everywhere. After Wei Wei Bai came in, feminine things immediately entered the room. In his black, white, and gray closet, half of the space was divided into dresses of various colors. A black suit and a skirt of soft colors crossed each other. It looked exceptionally beautiful and harmonious. In recent years, Xia Hanyang's mental misophobia had become more and more serious, and it had become a disease. There was not a single trace of anyone else in his house. It was so clean that it looked like an empty shell, more like a black and white graveyard. All these years, other than working, he had been looking for her. His life had been filled with these two things. He was like a walking corpse who had completely lost his soul. After Wei Wei Bai was forced to go home by Xia Hanyang, she curiously looked for her own photos. Sure enough, as the system said, she found them in several places. On the dartboard, her photos were full of darts. In the gym, on the sandbag, the barbell, and the weightlifting machine were all pasted with her photos. Chapter 1933. What was even more terrifying was the wall of the study. Her photo was in black and white. So Xia Hanyang had been looking at her photo all these years to be able to work hard? Wei Wei Bai silently wiped her cold sweat. She was lucky that Xia Hanyang didn't strangle her to death. She also didn't expect that the consequences of deceiving her feelings would make the victim hate her so much. After Xia Hanyang left her at home, he didn't show up for the first day. He didn't even come back to spend the night, but a nanny came to take care of her. Seeing the nanny's aged face, she remembered. Wasn't this the nanny who took care of Xia Hanyang 6 years ago? The nanny looked at her speechlessly. In the end, she really had nothing to say. She silently cooked her favorite dishes. Then, she packed everything up and left. Finally, she couldn't help but say, "Young master has a good heart. Live well with him." Then, she closed the door and locked it. This was Xia Hanyang's order. She couldn't have a chance to escape. At night, Xia Hanyang came back. He had a coat in his hand. The white collar was open, and there were traces of sweat on his neck. The system said he just went to beat up his boxing teacher. Wei Wei Bai, the nanny, also came back again. She bought a lot of vegetables and a lot of supplements. Xia Hanyang pretended to look at Wei Wei Bai casually. He found her half lying on the sofa, reading a casual novel. She looked up faintly. Her eyes reflected the light. She looked at him like this. There was no intense emotion, but she was unusually focused. Then, she lowered her head to read again. She didn't resist or run away. Xia Hanyang, who had just vented his irritation in the boxing field, appeared again. He threw the coat to the nanny. Then he turned around and went to the study. Looking at the black and white photo on the wall of the study, he was in a daze for a long time. Suddenly, he punched it, but it hit the wall and the photo fell down. Then, he endured the pain in his hand and put the photo away. The nanny came and went in a hurry. She only came to clean up the house, cook dinner, and keep the supplements warm before leaving. Wei Wei Bai was very quiet. If Xia Hanyang wasn't sure that she couldn't open the door, he thought that she had run away. Xia Hanyang took several deep breaths in the study before he was sure that he had mastered the rhythm of his emotions. Then, he walked out with a cold face and searched for the first aid box. He applied ointment on the red wound on his hand and pasted a large elastic bandage on it. His back was facing Wei Wei Bai and he did not look at her. His posture was arrogant and cold. Then he said, "Eat, lest you think I want to starve you." Wei Wei Bai calmly put down the book and went to the dining table without any resistance. The housekeeper was very good at cooking. The dishes on the table were steaming hot and very appetizing. Wei Wei Bai calmly picked up her chopsticks. Xia Hanyang suddenly threw the chopsticks on the table and raised his chin slightly. "My hand is injured. Come and feed me." Wei Wei Bai held the bowl and looked up at him silently, which made Xia Hanyang lose his composure. Just as he thought that Wei Wei Bai would reject him out of humiliation, Mo Tiange suddenly changed her mind. Wei Wei Bai suddenly picked up a piece of meat and put it to his lips. "Eat." Her tone was very calm, but for some reason, there was a hint of sweetness in her voice. It was as if she was seducing him. Xia Hanyang felt that he might have gone crazy because he missed her so much. Even if she didn't do anything, he would think that she was seducing him. Xia Hanyang's eyes were hot, and his lips were tightly pressed. After a while, he finally opened his mouth and ate.
Button.
Chapter 1934. Wei Wei Bai didn't seem to think much about it. She lowered her head and put some rice into her mouth. She had just fed him, and then she ate with the same chopsticks. It was an indirect kiss. Xia Hanyang looked at her calm face. Didn't she realize how flirtatious this action was? Wei Wei Bai ate some rice and then thought of something. She picked up some rice with her chopsticks and put it in front of his mouth. Eat some staple food. You'll be hungry. Xia Hanyang looked at her calm eyes and finally confirmed that she really didn't know what flirtatiousness was. He didn't remind her. He ate with the same pair of chopsticks until he was full. After the meal, Xia Hanyang threw the tableware into the dishwasher. Then he said with a straight face, "I want to take a bath." Afraid that she didn't understand his hint, he emphasized again, "My hand is injured. Help me wash it." She was already his little lover that he had bought, so he couldn't do anything to her. Xia Hanyang repeated it dozens of times in his heart before he could say such shameless words with such a calm expression. Wei Wei Bai didn't think that he was shameless at all. She nodded and said, "Okay, I'll fill the tub for you." Xia Hanyang thought that she didn't understand what he meant. Did she think that it would be fine as long as she filled the tub for him? However, after Wei Wei Bai filled the tub, she sat by it and touched the water temperature with her fair fingers. "Take off your clothes. Remember not to get your hands wet. I'll wipe your body for you." Her attitude was too natural and peaceful. It didn't make him think of anything else. It was as pure and clean as an adult bathing a child. There was no flirtatiousness in her eyes. Xia Hanyang stiffened for a while before he reached out and unbuttoned his shirt in a huff. A few buttons flew out from his violent actions. Xia Hanyang stared at her blushing face and finally smiled smugly. She wasn't so indifferent after all. Proud of her hesitation, Xia Hanyang tore off his clothes and threw them out. He stepped into the tub with his long legs full of strength and sat down. The water surged up and splashed out. Wei Wei Bai's clothes were wet. She immediately wanted to get up. Xia Hanyang quickly grabbed her arm, making her dress wet. Her clothes were thrown away by him, so she could only wear the dress he bought. Wei Wei Bai wore the little white dress that he had chosen. It was as soft as a white dodder flower. She seemed to be a little distressed as she looked at her skirt, but he couldn't leave. Xia Hanyang gave her the towel and said with his back to her, "Wipe my back." He ordered her, but she could hear the nervousness in his tone. Wei Wei Bai held the towel and said to the system, "If I jump over, I don't know if I'll gain some trust." System blocked. Wei Wei Bai didn't hear any response from the dog head system. He thought about it for a moment. It was not the right time yet. If he could obtain her body but not her heart, it would be a waste of effort. If she was too enthusiastic, Xia Hanyang would not believe her if she took the initiative in the future. So Wei Wei Bai scrubbed his back as if she was looking at a dead pig.
/T.
Chapter 1935. It seemed that her plan was to let him feel her softening and then fall in love with him. It wouldn't work. He wouldn't believe her even a little kindness. This series of thoughts was just a half-second contemplation in his mind. Wei Wei Bai's eyes flashed a trace of sober fierceness. She wanted to break Xia Hanyang's current heart defense. It was useless to be gentle. She could only break it open by brute force and fight to live. Only by doing whatever she wanted could she have a future. Therefore, when Xia Hanyang desperately wrapped his arms around her body and used violence to force her to obey him, Xia Shaluo was stunned. Wei Wei Bai's fingers scratched the skin on the back of his neck, and blood flowed out. Xia Hanyang's eyes became clear for a moment. At this moment, Wei Wei Bai had reached out and smashed the shower gel beside the bathtub on his head. Her previous resistance was suppressed by him. This successful attack made Xia Hanyang's eyes turn black for a moment, and his brain began to shake, and he began to feel dizzy. Wei Wei Bai quickly pushed him away and immediately climbed out of the bathtub. But Xia Hanyang was like a beast out of the cage. He rushed over and reached out to grab her beautiful and delicate ankle. Wei Wei Bai gritted her teeth, raised her foot, and kicked his inner thigh. Xia Hanyang frowned and took a breath. He gnashed his teeth and roared, "Wei Wei Bai." It seemed that he was going to eat her. He was going to eat her. Wei Wei Bai was almost eaten. She covered her chest with one hand. Her dress was torn and wet, sticking to her beautiful figure. She quickly opened the bathroom door and ran out. Xia Hanyang endured the pain, but he was still enchanted by her flying black hair and delicate and beautiful appearance. Without hesitation, he went out with fire all over his body. She couldn't run away. In addition to the key, the apartment was locked with his fingerprint. The key was with the nanny. She couldn't get out of this apartment at all. He canceled the password because she might know it. He wouldn't take the risk of letting her run away again. Sure enough, he saw Wei Wei Bai trying to open the door. Her face was pitifully pale, and panic finally made her calm expression disappear. Seeing her like this, Xia Hanyang was actually excited and happy. Finally, he was no longer cold. Even if she hated him, rebelled against him, cursed him, or even cried her eyes out.
Just don't look at him calmly.
He did not want to be a toy in her eyes, nor did he want to be a dispensable plaything in her eyes. He would rather become the perpetrator and have absolute control over her life. He would never allow her to look at him with a calm expression again. It turned out that the most painful thing in this world was not having the person you love hate you. It was that he didn't care about himself. Not caring about him was the most vicious injury. Wei Wei Bai saw that she could not open the door and immediately gave up. Her lips trembled as she ran into the room. Xia Hanyang reached out and touched her long hair with his fingers, but he couldn't bear to hold it tightly. Instead, he let the long hair slide through his palm. He remembered that time when he sat behind her at the table. Every time he saw her long hair sweep across his table, that gentle and beautiful feeling. It gave him the urge to touch her. In the end, as a prank, he cut off a few strands of her hair, but he regretted it afterward. Because her hair was so beautiful, he still hid the handkerchief with her hair. He didn't know how to survive all these years. He didn't dare to look through her things. He sealed the house they lived in together, including the library that was full of her shadow. No one was allowed to open the lock, touch, or even move it. It was like a cruel box that was full of her traces. Chapter 1936. He didn't dare to open it.
No one was allowed to touch it.
Wei Wei Bai quickly ran into the room, immediately closed the door and locked it. She dragged the table over to block the door. Then she leaned against the edge of the table and wiped the water droplets off her face with relief before sitting down on the ground. Xia Hanyang's sudden outbreak of madness was really frightening. But Xia Hanyang, who was standing by the door, was not anxious at all. He unhurriedly stretched out his palm and sniffed it. It was the fragrance of her hair, so light that it was almost indiscernible. He couldn't help but hold his fingers and smile. The real her could really make his cold and dark heart come back to life more than anything else. He slowly walked to the door and knocked on it unhurriedly. "Wei Wei, come out. I haven't finished showering yet." Wei Wei Bai didn't dare to say anything. He could even feel her nervous gasp. Xia Hanyang had never felt so powerful. He was too humble when he was a teenager. In his eyes, she was the winner who had absolute control over him. Now their roles had finally been reversed. It was his turn to control everything about her now. He would rather be the most terrible pervert and trap her with fear and violence than return to that humble time when he could lose her at any time. Xia Hanyang thought that she would keep hiding and not dare to say anything. He was very clear that he had scared her. But when he knocked on the door again, her slightly trembling voice came from the door. "Xia Hanyang, calm down. I'm going to call the police." Xia Hanyang slowly revealed a smile. His tone was low. "Oh, call the police? I'll give you my phone. Come out and get it." The communication equipment in the apartment had been broken and thrown away by him. The window glass was soundproof, and the apartment was high. She couldn't cry for help. Her best opportunity to escape was gone when he was in the hospital, and his mind was unstable. They had just met again. He knew that in her eyes. He must be as stupid as he was 6 years ago. It was all a lie. He had to let her think that his character was similar to that of a teenager, that he could be reasoned with and fooled. That was why she didn't put up a strong resistance and tried to escape. But when she entered this place, he didn't need to pretend anymore because she didn't have a chance to escape. Xia Hanyang said gently, "Come out. You're my little lover now. You have to listen to whatever I say." His hands were completely different from his voice. She slammed the door violently. He clearly had the key, but he had to force her like this. As expected, Wei Wei Bai's voice finally broke. Her voice trembled, unable to maintain her arrogant indifference. "Xia Hanyang, I let you down 6 years ago, but you can't do this to me." Xia Hanyang's hand paused slightly. He couldn't help but laugh. "You're sorry? No. How could you let me down? You clearly didn't show much interest in me from the beginning to the end. It was all my wishful thinking. It's not your fault." It wasn't her fault that she didn't like him. As if. Xia Hanyang's eyes were bloodshot. She was the one who provoked him. Her not liking him was the biggest betrayal to him. Xia Hanyang could never forgive her. He couldn't let go of her. Xia Hanyang's hand was still slamming the door, creating great pressure for her. His voice was extremely gentle. "So, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid that I'll rape you?" Wei Wei Bai. Damn, you're self-aware.
T.
Chapter 1937. She had misjudged Xia Hanyang's dark and morbid state. After he finished, he couldn't help but laugh. "I won't do this kind of thing. After all, we have signed a contract, so no matter what I do to you, both of us are in love. It's okay even if you resist, it's all fun." What a beast. He was worse than a beast. Using such a gentle tone to talk about such a terrible thing. Xia Hanyang was just short of holding a knife to become a serial killer. Wei Wei Bai frowned and could only reach out to pinch her inner thigh. She was in so much pain that tears came out and her voice choked. Xia Hanyang felt that it was about time. He was just about to get the key to open the door. Suddenly, there was an almost inaudible sobbing sound coming from inside the door.
His body stiffened.
His unbridled thoughts of harming her were actually suppressed by her faintly discernible cries for a moment. Xia Hanyang bit his lips and looked at the door with red eyes. She was finally afraid and in pain. She could finally feel the despair he had felt all these years. Xia Hanyang thought vengefully, feeling both happy and sad. She didn't know how long she cried, and Xia Hanyang didn't know how long he stood there. Until the system's voice came. I was blocked just now. What happened to you?" Wei Wei Bai looked up. Her eyes were clear, and there were traces of tears, but there were no tears. She touched her throat. It was a little hoarse, caused by forcing herself to cry. Xia Hanyang left. She knew when she heard his footsteps leave the door. The system looked. He seemed to be walking out while putting on his coat. His expression, twisted and divided. It was a little scary. Wei Wei Bai calmly got up and poured herself a glass of water. Xia Hanyang's psychological trauma is too great. The next battle may be tough. Twisted and perverted to that extent. His current state of mind was probably to take revenge on her. Let her experience the despair of being abused. The system frowned. He tried to commit suicide. The information was sometimes updated. It wasn't very detailed in the beginning. The suicide information was just updated. Wei Wei Bai, didn't you say that he went on a hunger strike? The system said, no, it was the 4th year after you left. He was desperate to find you, so he drank and drove off the cliff into the sea. Wei Wei Bai held the cup and was speechless for a moment. She kept a copy of the surveillance video to prevent Xia Hanyang from committing suicide. She also vaguely knew that 100 favorable impression points might be hard to forget for a stubborn person. But it was really unexpected that Xia Hanyang would be so extreme. The system continued. Fortunately, there were no reefs where he fell, and the cliff was very low. It was low tide time, and there were fishing boats nearby, so he was saved. The male lead's luck was heaven-defying. Most disasters wouldn't kill them. However, Xia Hanyang, who had died once, had completely turned evil. Wei Wei Bai was silent for a while before she nodded. I got it. Do you have any information about me in prison? The system flipped through it. Yes, because it was made up by the main system, there weren't many twists and turns. It was very plain, and there weren't any accidents. But you can fill in the information yourself. As long as it doesn't exceed the main system's scope, you can add in some plots. Wei Wei Bai said, put in a few bullying cases and add in some injuries and illnesses. She didn't think that it would make much of a difference whether or not she told him about prison. But Xia Hanyang was so evil. She could only try her best to make use of the sensational past she had. Then she could find the right time to make him waver. The at https://www.
Sashu.
com/ the full text at https://www.
Sashu.
com/ download text at https://www.
Sashu.
com at https://m sashu. com / the. Chapter 1938. It was useless to convince Xia Hanyang that she loved him. He had to believe it himself. The system said, yes, but the bullying case won't be big, and your injuries won't be too serious. Because serious injuries would leave traces on the body, but Wei Wei Bai's body had no external injuries. Even that long hair was a flaw. After all, no one went to prison without cutting their hair. Sometimes the system had loopholes. Of course, these loopholes were very small, so everyone ignored them. Wei Wei Bai nodded, and then discussed with the system to fill in the details of prison life before she went to change her clothes. It was already late at night. Wei Wei Bai went to sleep peacefully. Xia Hanyang would probably not come back until tomorrow. But she overestimated her physical condition. Her weak body had a high fever in the middle of the night because of the torment. The system sensed her physical condition. Wei Wei Bai opened her eyes. Her face was red, but her eyes were frighteningly bright. I'm fine. If it's not a high fever of more than 40 degrees, it's life-threatening.
Don't worry about me.
Fever was not a big deal to her. In so many planes, she had been on the brink of death many times. She could face it freely and make use of it. The system wanted to persuade her, but when it saw her determined expression, it fell silent. Xia Hanyang drank with a few of his childhood friends. In the private room, there was a group of men dancing wildly. No woman dared to go near him. No one dared to touch him. Xia Hanyang had kicked a hostess and sent her to the hospital for gastric bleeding. This was not the first time. Everyone was scared. One of the followers, Qing, came over and said, Brother Xia, what happened to the company? Why do you look so sad? Do you need my family's help? Another one, Li Dayan, rushed over and kicked Qing away. Who do you think you are? If something really happened to Brother Xia's company, what's the use of your family's small company? Then he said with a flattering face, Brother Xia, is your shoulder hurt from sitting too long in the meeting? Let me rub it for you. The rest of them made a sound of disgust. Xia Hanyang's face was extremely cold. He drank expressionlessly. It was as if he couldn't see what others were doing. However, he drank one cup after another. The brothers at the side were all shocked. Qing suddenly grabbed his hand. What happened? Ever since Xia Hanyang jumped into the sea, he had become much more reserved and calm. There were only a few times when he lost control like tonight. He felt uneasy. Every time Xia Hanyang was in a bad mood, it was related to that girl. Xia Hanyang was also half drunk. He pushed Qing away and looked coldly at the wine glass. I'm fine. I'm in a good mood. It was strange that he was in such a good mood. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but laugh. He gritted his teeth and said, I'm in a damn good mood. Suddenly, he thought of something and slammed the wine cup on the table. Then, he took out his phone and called his personal assistant. In the middle of the night, his assistant immediately picked up the phone. Tomorrow, pick some books with a strong literary value. Also, instruct someone to buy some medicinal herbs and tonics. I will give you the names of the herbs. These cannot be cut off. You have to supply them for a long time, He instructed in detail and was terrifyingly serious. He even included women's clothes, shoes, and small feminine products. They were mainly comfortable and soft. He also instructed that all the things should not be small and sharp. Chun Qing couldn't help but elbow Lin Shui next to him. Hey, what's wrong with the boss? Do you plan to enter the medicinal herbs industry or the feminine products industry?
T.
Chapter 1939. Lin Shui rolled her eyes at him. How would I know? It sounds like living with a woman. Chun Qing and his friends were dumbfounded. Living together? After that, Xia Hanyang continued drinking. They pushed and shoved, and finally, Li Dayan was pushed out as a scapegoat. Brother Xia, are you in love? Xia Hanyang paused, looked up lazily, and then said coldly, Yes, I've been in love for 7 years. Don't you know? They met and spent nearly a year together. Then she disappeared for 6 years. 7 years was just right. After that, he glanced at the time and suddenly felt that it was very boring. He picked up his coat. I'm leaving. Chun Qing immediately got up. I'll be the driver. He restrained himself and didn't drink too much. He didn't trust Xia Hanyang to drive in this state. 2 years ago, they were scared to death when he fell into the sea. Xia Hanyang didn't say anything and walked out calmly. The room fell into a dead silence. Lin Shui suddenly said, Don't tell me you found Wei Wei Bai. His words stirred up the 1,000-layer stone, and everyone exploded. Finally, we found her. Will we have a good life in the future? Thank God. Congratulations to Brother Xia for getting rid of the fate of being alone. I think Brother Xia will strangle Wei Wei Bai to death. Everyone was silent. What she said was very reasonable, and they had nothing to say. Xia Hanyang sat in the passenger seat with his eyes closed. His face was still dignified and cold, and his frown made people know that he was very uncomfortable. Chun Qing couldn't help but ask, Did you really find her? Xia Hanyang opened his eyes. Under the flashing streetlights, his eyes were clear and dark. Yes, I found her. I went to the place where she used to be and found her trace. Chun Qing knew Xia Hanyang's obsession. At that time, several of them followed him, but they watched as he went crazy for Bai Weiwei step by step. After Wei Wei Bai disappeared, Xia Hanyang was desperate and crazy. Just thinking about it made the few of them fall into despair. At that time, they were worried about leaving Xia Hanyang alone. Chun Qing still remembered the desperate look on Xia Hanyang's face when he tried to find Wei Wei Bai again and again, but to no avail. If he hadn't happened to be there and rushed over to grab the knife, Xia Hanyang would have been finished. Over the past 6 years, Xia Hanyang's tendency to self-destruct had become more and more serious, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Even old Master Xia was filled with regret. If he knew that he would be like this after losing Wei Wei Bai, he shouldn't have let Wei Wei Bai leave. So, what if Wei Wei Bai doesn't like Xia Hanyang? It was enough for Xia Hanyang to survive. Chun Qing held the steering wheel nervously. Then, what do you plan to do? Xia Hanyang's love and hatred for Wei Wei Bai were extremely terrible. The psychiatrist couldn't do anything about Xia Hanyang. They could only pray that Xia Hanyang would get over it himself. Xia Hanyang looked at his fingers indifferently, as if he was imagining the temperature of Wei Wei Bai's hair. What can I do? I'll lock her up until I die. Even if I go to hell, I'll take her with me. Although Chun Qing had some guesses in his heart, when Xia Hanyang really said it, he gasped. Brother Xia, this is a crime. They were young and frivolous and did a lot of marginal things. But now that they had entered their own families and become heirs, they matured a lot. They wouldn't touch many things in the past. A faint smile appeared on Xia Hanyang's calm face. A crime? She's an orphan. She has no parents and no relatives. I don't know where she has been these years, but it seems that she hasn't established her own social network. No one will notice if such a person disappears. Download. Chapter 1940. Chun Qing felt cold in his heart. He was not worried that Xia Hanyang would be caught if Wei Wei Bai was locked up. He was worried that Xia Hanyang would become more and more extreme and eventually reach an irreversible, desperate situation. In Xia Hanyang's current state, it was not impossible for him to die with Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai didn't like Xia Hanyang at that time. Everyone knew that. After all, Wei Wei Bai's performance was so good that no one could deny that she liked Xia Hanyang. They couldn't say anything about Xia Hanyang's passion. Now, 6 years later, Wei Wei Bai had no feelings for Xia Hanyang. Chen Qing couldn't help persuading him. Brother Xia, let go of the past. Now that she is back, you can treat her well. Xia Hanyang's eyes were extremely cold. I've done it before. No one can be as good as a bootlicker, but she still doesn't like me. So, if I treat her well, she will only ask for more. She won't like me at all. Xia Hanyang said calmly, my current family background and ability are enough to deal with any accident involving her.
Don't worry.
Chen Qing thought, that's what I'm worried about. He wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, he remained silent. Xia Hanyang got out of the car smelling of alcohol. He staggered a few steps before he could stand firm. Let's go back. After that, Xia Hanyang ignored him and couldn't wait to go home. He opened the door, and the light turned on automatically. The room was full of light. Xia Hanyang looked at the books thrown casually on the sofa, the flowers on the table, and some peeled candy wrappers. The deathly stillness of his room had vanished shortly after her arrival. Xia Hanyang walked to the door, which was still tightly locked. Was she asleep? He glanced at the time. It was 3:00 in the morning. Xia Hanyang was drunk and even a little confused, but he didn't have the impulse to revenge. He took the key and unlocked the door, only to find that it was blocking the table. Was she so afraid of him? Xia Hanyang pursed his lips and narrowed his eyes unhappily. He pushed the corner of the table with one hand and then walked into the room. Without making a sound, he pushed the table away with one hand. Under the dim yellow light of the small table lamp, a petite figure was lying on the bed. Xia Hanyang walked softly to the bed and wanted to kiss her. He even slowed down his breathing for fear of scaring her. He lifted a corner of the quilt. Xia Hanyang looked at her flushed face. It was no longer as pale as it usually was. The bright red color of her face was gorgeous and attractive. His slow mind was a little strange. He couldn't help but reach out to touch her face. The burning temperature shocked him. Wei Wei. He sobered up halfway and immediately reached out to shake her. Bai Weiwei gently opened her eyes, which were extremely moist. Now, she had a bit more vitality, and in the darkness, there was a beauty that was not usually there. He didn't know how long it. Xia Hanyang was when he saw Bai Weiwei didn't know what she saw, but she showed a fragile smile. Mom, you came to pick me up? His hands suddenly trembled, and he could only stare blankly at her smile. She rarely saw Bai Weiwei smile so purely and softly. Her eyes seemed to be shining with gentle stars, which was completely different from her usual indifference. Weiwei Bai stretched out her weak hand, held his palm, and gently rubbed her hot face in his palm. Mom, I'm so tired. I'm really tired. A fragile teardrop fell into Xia Hanyang's palm. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for what to do with the warm and quickly cooling liquid. He looked at her blankly for a while. Then, he couldn't help but soften his gloomy eyes. He almost sighed and said, "What should I do with you?" In the dark night, he looked at her so fragile under the influence of alcohol and let his gentleness wanton. Chapter 1941. Weiwei Bai opened her eyes in a daze, as if she couldn't recognize him. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but say, "Weiwei, you have a fever." Weiwei Bai shook her head gently. "It's okay. I'll be fine." "Be fine? Just a little?" Of course, Xia Hanyang wouldn't let her be so patient. He reached across her back and under her knees, wrapped the quilt around her, and carried her away. It was the fastest way to go to the hospital with such a fever. Weiwei Bai was a little confused. She was confused by the fever. She rubbed her face against Xia Hanyang's chest and suddenly couldn't help complaining to herself, so hard. Xia Hanyang's body stiffened for a moment. His muscles couldn't be soft. He pursed his lips, didn't do anything excessive, and quickly walked out. Wei Wei Bai was so tired that she slowly closed her eyes. She seemed to be talking to herself, and her voice was very hoarse. "Mom, I met a boy. He was very good to me." Xia Hanyang's brain was pierced by something sharp, and his voice became cold. "Who? Which boy? In the past 6 years, did Wei Wei Bai really like an adulterer?" Wei Wei Bai said in a daze, "A boy who doesn't like to study." Xia Hanyang paused, and then ran faster to the elevator. Was she talking about him? His heart was beating fast, and he couldn't help but ask, "Do you hate him?" Wei Wei Bai was silent for a moment, as if it was very difficult to ask this question. Finally, she sighed and said, "Yes, I hate him." This answer was not unexpected. Xia Hanyang's scarred heart didn't even have any fluctuations of pain. When he went downstairs, he saw that Qin Qing was still there. He was smoking with a troubled look, and when he saw Xia Hanyang, he was so shocked that he almost ate the cigarette. Then he saw Xia Hanyang holding a person in his arms. Finally, love turned to hate, and he strangled her to death. Was he going to destroy the evidence? Xia Hanyang saw that he was in a daze and kicked him. Drive to the hospital. Afraid that she would die, Qin Qing quickly ran into the car. Xia Hanyang also carried her into the back seat and closed the door. The car drove out. Xia Hanyang's face was gloomy. Wei Wei Bai's face was very red because of her fever. The wind blew in through the window, and he immediately closed it. Suddenly, he heard her mumble, "But he's very handsome." Xia Hanyang held his breath and asked, as if he was afraid of waking her up, "How beautiful?" Wei Wei Bai didn't answer. He lowered his head and found that she was confused by the fever and couldn't open her eyes. Xia Hanyang couldn't help hugging her tightly, feeling a little sad. But she said that he was good-looking. At least in her eyes, there was something about him that attracted her. Even if it was in terms of appearance, this time, Wei Wei Bai had a fever. She was busy in the hospital all night before her fever subsided. However, his body was abnormally weak and had been in a deep sleep. Xia Hanyang specially invited the old Chinese doctor. This old Chinese medicine doctor was an expert in the field of healthcare. He was here to help Xia Sand adjust his body. The old Chinese medicine doctor felt the pulse of the sleeping Wei Wei Bai for a long time and carefully looked at her face. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. After he went out with Xia Hanyang, he said, "We have to change the prescription. She's so weak at such a young age. She'll suffer when she gets older." Xia Hanyang's lips trembled. If she hadn't left 6 years ago, her current body wouldn't have been like this under his care. She couldn't even take care of herself, but she dared to leave him. Xia Hanyang walked into the ward with a deep and tired face. He found that after the fever subsided, Wei Wei Bai woke up with a pale face. She seemed to be a little confused and looked at the hospital. Then she slowly looked at him. The download address is at https://www.
Sashu. Come.
Chapter 1942. Xia Hanyang stood at the door for a long time before slowly walking into the ward. He didn't care about anything. After walking over, he held her head and kissed her hair. After reuniting, he was very presumptuous and strong to her. He liked her and loved her. That had never changed. It was normal to love someone and want to be close to them. He didn't pretend to be a hypocrite. He gave up his benefits because she didn't want to. Wei Wei Bai was stunned. She moved her lips but didn't protest in the end. Xia Hanyang poured water for her and stared at her drinking it. Maybe his eyes were so focused that Wei Wei Bai seemed to be a little unaccustomed to it. She frowned and said, "What's wrong with me?" Xia Hanyang stared at her unhealthy face for a long time before sitting down on the chair beside the bed. "You have a fever. The highest temperature is about 40 degrees. Wei Wei Bai was still calm and didn't think that a high fever was a big deal. She said politely, "Thank you for sending me to the hospital." Xia Hanyang's face was still taut. His eyes were filled with dark and surging emotions. Then he rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Back then, did you really not like me at all?" He finally asked in a hoarse voice and tried his best to keep calm. When he asked this question, he didn't even dare to look at Wei Wei Bai. Wei Wei Bai held the glass of water. Hearing this question, she seemed to be a little surprised. She looked at him in a trance for a moment. Then she smiled softly. It's a little long ago. I don't remember it clearly. Xia Hanyang's expression froze for a moment, and then sadness climbed into his eyes. He smiled sarcastically. That's right. It's natural for you to forget it after so many years. Wei Wei Bai touched the glass unhurriedly, as if she didn't care about Xia Hanyang's attitude. It was such a calm attitude that provoked Xia Hanyang. For a moment, he even had the urge to smash the ward. He hated this expression of hers the most. He was always asking for humiliation in front of her. Wei Wei Bai tilted her head and looked at him with a kind of calm and soft eyes. There was no resentment or fear. She suddenly whispered, "You've grown up." Back then, Xia Hanyang was reckless and insolent, and his adolescent hormones were off the charts. The current him had a sinister look on his face, and his body and temperament were incomparably mature. Xia Hanyang said sarcastically, "It's been a few years. You've been starving yourself into malnutrition. That's why you haven't grown anything." After he finished speaking, his gaze lingered on her chest for a few seconds before he awkwardly looked away. Wei Wei Bai did not care about his attitude. Her face was very pale, so pale that it was unhealthy. Xia Hanyang stared at her face for a while and suppressed his impulse to smash the house. He forcefully pushed this topic away. After so many years of despair, he wanted an answer. "You clearly didn't like me back then, so why did you keep playing the game of boyfriend and girlfriend with me? Don't you think it's childish?" Wei Wei Bai calmly touched the cup with her fingertips. After a moment of silence, she sighed and said, "Aren't you the same as you are now?" Xia Hanyang had grown up a little, but his overbearing and vicious character had never changed. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a moment, and then he reacted. "Are you saying that back then, it was because I took you by force, just like now, that you had no choice but to be with me?" Wei Wei Bai smiled and softly responded, "At that time, you liked to bully people very much. I couldn't afford to waste my time with you, so I could only comply with you." Xia Hanyang's fingertips were cold, and his face was full of sarcasm with a faint smile. "In your eyes, I'm really a bad person." Download the at https://m/sashu.com. Chapter 1943. He thought she was playing with him at that time. What was worse was that she thought he was going to bully her, so she had no choice but to deal with it. Wei Wei Bai shook her head. "Later, I felt that you weren't really bad, so I wanted you to study hard." The veins on the back of Xia Hanyang's hand were about to pop out. "Enough. Study, study. What else can you do besides study? Look at yourself. Can your so-called study make your body better? Or can it let you live a rich life? My current life is not about studying. It's about my foundation that allows me to stand in this position." He had known since he was a child. He was born to stand taller than 90% of people. Even if he was a good-for-nothing, he could live a life of luxury without doing anything. Therefore, studying was not essential to him, and those few test papers were even more useless. He had put in so much effort to study and take the college entrance examination. It wasn't for the score, but to make her happy. Wei Wei Bai's face turned paler. She seemed to have been enduring, and cracks appeared in her calm eyes. Her fingers stroked the quilt, and the tips of her fingers were red and unusually conspicuous. Finally, she lowered her head, and her long hair fell on her cheeks. Her pale face made one's heart palpitate, and her lips had lost the color of healthy people, leaving only a thin layer of pink. Even her clear and calm eyes had lost their color and were incomparably gloomy. She looked so fragile that she could disappear at any time. Xia Hanyang looked at her silently, and his heart ached because of her. He hated her for being so cold, but he also resented her for being so fragile and pitiful. Suddenly, he heard her murmur something in a low voice. He couldn't help but ask, "What did you say?" Wei Wei Bai was silent for a moment, and then she looked up and revealed a sad smile. I can only study Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang was at a loss for a moment. He had no idea what she was talking about. After a while, he suddenly woke up with a start. He recalled the information that he had investigated when he first met her. She had no parents, and her beastly adoptive father was simply a disaster for her. She was so poor that she had nothing. He had been to the place where she lived, and he couldn't imagine how a person could live in that kind of place. So he knew that she studied hard to get out of her predicament. But Xia Hanyang frowned and couldn't help retorting, "You have me. Even if you don't study and can't go to college, you can rely on me." He brought her home because his heart ached for her. He wanted to protect her. Could it be that she did not feel anything at all? When Wei Bai heard his words, her dim eyes lit up a little, but there was obvious mockery in them. "Rely on you? I don't deserve you, Xia Hanyang." Xia Hanyang suddenly clenched his fists and said angrily, "Who told you that you don't deserve me? Who dares to insult you in front of me?" At that time, he had protected her tightly. However, there was no telling which bastard would dare to steal his woman and bully Wei Bai. Wei Bai was also someone who didn't say anything. At that time, he had a rough temper, so she might not even know that she was being bullied. Wei Bai shook her head gently and said calmly, "This is the truth. I've never been in the same class as you. I've used up all my strength just to survive. I don't have the time to fall in love, and I don't have the time to like anyone. I don't have the qualifications to be with you." When Xia Hanyang heard this, a chill spread throughout his body. The calmer she was, the more frightened he was. Wei Bai actually said such words of inferiority. In his eyes, she had always been arrogant and calm. Even if she lived in such a terrible place, he didn't see a trace of uncleanness on her. Chapter 1944. In front of her, he felt that he was the one who should feel inferior. Xia Hanyang couldn't help asking, "Why do you have this idea? Is it because of what my grandfather said?" "You don't have to listen to what that old man said." "I am." Wei Bai couldn't help but smile, but there was no joy. She even looked a little cold. "No, this society is so cruel. I'm just mature early. Instead of pinning my hopes on your illusory love, it's better to take the money and leave. In this way, everyone will be happy. In this way, everyone will be happy." Xia Hanyang's voice was almost shrill. "Everyone is happy, but I'm not." Wei Bai didn't move at all. She said softly and indifferently, "Xia Hanyang, I've never been good. I was poor and had low self-esteem. I relied on studying hard to maintain my fragile self-esteem. I endured humiliation to survive. I knew that Beast had bad intentions towards me, but I still lived in his house." Speaking of this, the indifferent arrogance on her face finally disappeared. Instead, there was a trace of resentment. Because of this cruel expression, her pale face burst into an unimaginable coldness. She said softly, "I was afraid of being bullied by you. I would rather pretend to stay with you than resist and leave. I was more greedy for a comfortable and wealthy life, so I took 10 million yuan and left directly." Xia Hanyang said coldly, "That's enough. If you really love money, you can be rich by holding on to me. Why did you accept that old man's 10 million yuan? She was not an idiot. Compared with 10 million yuan, even a retard would know that it was expensive." Wei Bai sneered. "Because it's easier and more comfortable to take 10 million yuan than to be with you." Xia Hanyang almost ground out his words. "Are you done? After all, you don't like me and want to get rid of me to take money." Wei Bai was stunned and stared at him silently. She forced a smile. "I can't like you." Xia Hanyang couldn't understand. "Why can't you like me?" Wei Bai finally couldn't stand it anymore. She smashed the cup on the ground and looked at Xia Hanyang with red eyes. "Because I'm not worthy. I have nothing. In front of you, other than my self-esteem, which part of me is worthy of you?" She gnashed her teeth and said to Xia Hanyang in a fierce voice, "I can't afford to lose. I can't put everything I have on a high and mighty man like you, who is rich and has countless ways to retreat. I'm not stupid. If I like you, you'll still be the young master of the Xia family. If something goes wrong, what would I be then? Xia Hanyang looked at her blankly. He had never seen her explode like that before. The calmness in her eyes disappeared and was replaced by all kinds of twisted pain. Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips and tilted her head. Her sarcastic words were somewhat vicious. What is like? It's comparable to getting into a good school and getting a good job to keep me alive. It was still comparable to the 2 steamed buns my mother bought when she was half-starving when she went to the construction site to earn money. Or does it give me a sense of security compared to the 10 million? Wei Wei Bai said, a person who can't survive is not worthy of liking anyone. If I like you regardless of everything, I can only die if you don't want me. Xia Hanyang stared at her blankly. All kinds of words were stuck in his chest. He didn't dare to say a word. He had never seen this side of Wei Wei Bai. She was realistic, indifferent, and heartbreaking. Tearing apart her cold and arrogant appearance, he saw that she was actually cold and calculative. She was calculative even when she liked him, for fear that she would lose money if she liked him. You can see it when you open the bookshelf next time. If you like. Chapter 1945. Tearing apart her cold and arrogant appearance, her various calculations were unexpectedly cold to this extent. She was so calculative even when she liked him, as if she was afraid that liking him would result in a loss. Xia Hanyang finally couldn't help but say, "Are you so sure that I will abandon you?" He couldn't refute her words, because he did have countless ways to retreat. But she didn't. Wei Wei Bai looked at him coldly. I'm not sure, but my life doesn't allow me to do uncertain things, so I can only abandon the possibility of liking and falling in love with you. After saying that, Wei Wei Bai seemed to collapse. She looked away and said indifferently, You see, I've never been the beautiful person in your memory. I have all kinds of shortcomings and I'm stingy and calculative. I won't abandon the bread of life for so-called liking and love. How many days can you like me like this? Let's go, Xia Hanyang. After saying that, she didn't look at him and said in a weak voice, I'm very tired. Don't make me more tired. Xia Hanyang sat beside her in a daze, his mind a mess. Seeing her pale face and cold sweat on her forehead, he knew that she was really tired. Xia Hanyang suddenly got up and turned to leave. He saw Wei Wei Bai's lips suddenly curl into a self-deprecating smile from the corner of his eyes. It was as if she was mocking him. She was right. Once she revealed her character full of shortcomings, his attitude towards her changed drastically. After Xia Hanyang left, the system dared to speak. Don't you want to be a cold and aloof little fairy? You want to be a vicious, supporting female character who lacked love in childhood? Wei Wei Bai frowned. I can't help it. Otherwise, I couldn't find a reason to dislike Xia Hanyang, so I had no choice but to sully myself. The biggest knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. She didn't like him. So as long as she could solve the knot in his heart, the rest was not a big problem. So she didn't dare to like others because of her personality flaw. It wasn't because Xia Hanyang was too bad that she didn't like him. Thinking of this, Xia Hanyang's heart knot was untied. The system said, If you do this, aren't you afraid that the male lead's feelings for you will turn cold? What the fuck? His personality had changed from an arrogant straight-A student to an inferiority complex and vengeful one. This contrast was so big that it made people's faces twitch. Wei Wei Bai snorted. The mission has been completed. Xia Hanyang's favorability has dropped to 0. That's right, it actually forgot that the mission was completed. Therefore, the host intends to let loose. Was she back to being a little princess again? The system suddenly said, The male lead has returned. Without any hesitation, Wei Wei Bai immediately reached out and rubbed her eyes. Then, she crossed her hands on her knees and buried her head in her hands, pursing her lips tightly. The sound of choking sobs could be heard again and again, as if it was scratching the heart and liver of the people. System. This ability to cry just like that, Xia Hanyang's footsteps paused for a long time. Only then did he regain his speed and walk to the bedside. He saw that she was almost curled up, as if this position could give her a sense of security. She buried her head in her knees, trembling all over as she tried to suppress her cries. She didn't even know that he had returned. Xia Hanyang reached out his trembling hand, as if he wanted to touch her head to stop her from crying. However, a burst of anger made him impulsive. He suddenly put his hand on her shoulder and pressed her down on the bed. Wei Wei Bai was caught off guard, revealing her tear-filled face. She looked at him awkwardly and couldn't react for a while. Xia Hanyang's eyebrows were still gloomy and ruthless, but the expression in his eyes was complex and twisted. He suddenly said in a low voice, "I don't know how long I can like you." Wei Wei Bai looked at him blankly with tear-filled eyes. She struggled to wipe her tears, not wanting him to see such a vulnerable side of her. However, Xia Hanyang pressed her hand firmly. He touched her tears with his fingers and wiped them away bit by bit. He was gentle but very strong, even a little morbid. "I only know that from the moment I met you until now, my feelings for you have never changed." After he finished speaking, he laughed at himself. "Wei Wei Bai, I still like you. Maybe I can like you for a lifetime. Believe it or not." Wei Wei Bai's lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something. However, Xia Hanyang bent down. His breath blew on the tip of her ear, as if he wanted to integrate her into his body and hold her. "By the way, I also have many shortcomings. Aren't we a good match? Do you think you can make me let you go by saying a few more trivial shortcomings?" His voice turned cold. "You look down on me too much. I can bury your dead body for you. What right do you have to say that you don't deserve to like me? You're a scumbag and I'm cheap. You're more than enough for me. Are you thinking about when I won't like you anymore? Wait slowly. Anyway, before I stop liking you, I'll lock you up. No one can escape." That was why he was such a terrible person. How could she say that she wasn't qualified to like him? Xia Hanyang finally couldn't help kissing her forehead. He was incredibly gentle. Ding. The male lead's favorability is at 96. Button. Chapter 1946. Xia Hanyang, in a suit, followed by his assistant and secretary, went to Old Master Xia's birthday party. Not many people came to the birthday party. They were all acquaintances, close friends, and people who had important business dealings with the Xia family. Xia Hanyang saw Xia-san, put the gift on the table casually, and said casually, "I see that you are as strong as an ox. I guess you can live for another 50 or 60 years." Old Master Xia was in his 70s. He would be an old monster in another 50 or 60 years. He knew that Xia Hanyang had always talked like this. Xia-san didn't say anything. Instead, he tapped the table with his fingers and said, "It's good enough that you don't have to stand at the door to welcome the guests. Why do you feel so uncomfortable to come to my party?" Xia Hanyang's expression was not good. His eyes were as dark as a ghost fire. Xia Hanyang's current state was that strangers should stay away and acquaintances should stay away. Xia Hanyang was expressionless. He took a glass of champagne from the waiter's plate and drank it up. "I salute you for having a long life." This was a show of respect, but it was extremely polite. Xia-san didn't ask him not to drive him away like this. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Why don't you bring her to see the guests?" Everyone in Xia Hanyang's circle knew that Wei Wei Bai had been found. Xia-san certainly knew. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they finally found the girl. Compared to whether Wei Wei Bai liked her or not, Xia Hanyang didn't care. After all, Xia Hanyang, who had lost Wei Wei Bai, was so desperate that he couldn't live. They were scared out of their wits. Therefore, Xia-san had no objection to the existence of Wei Wei Bai. It was fine as long as Xia Hanyang could live like a human being. Xia Hanyang's face was gloomy, but his tone softened. "She's still sick," and he hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "Now she's weak. I'm worried about her." After all, he was afraid that she would run away. Xia-san said, "Treat her gently."
She can't be locked up like this.
Xia Hanyang said expressionlessly, "This is the only way to keep her from leaving." He couldn't take the risk of her leaving. Xia-san, he didn't even know how to persuade him. Xia-san hesitated again and again. He wanted to say something, but in the end, He remembered that he hadn't gotten the information yet, so he didn't say anything. Xia Hanyang glanced at the time and said, "Well, I'm leaving." "Xia-san, it's my birthday, and you're leaving after 5 minutes?" Xia Hanyang said, "I have a family now. How are you going to have a great-grandchild if I keep accompanying you, old man?" Xia-san's face twitched. The other party was willing. It was one thing to be imprisoned. If he were to force it, his grandson would be too lowly. Xia Hanyang smiled. "Of course, she's very willing." "Xia-san, no persuasive ability at all. His grandson is jumping back and forth on the edge of committing a crime. His heart is so tired." Xia Hanyang turned around and left. Xia 3 rubbed his face tiredly and said to the people beside him, "Let's speed up the investigation." No matter how he investigated back then, he couldn't find any information on Weiwei Bai. Moreover, there was one thing that old master Xia couldn't understand. Why hadn't the 10 million yuan been fulfilled back then? She found Weiwei Bai to untie the knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. She had to find out why Weiwei Bai left. Weiwei Bai had been discharged from the hospital for 3 days. Xia Hanyang left the nanny by her side to take care of her. Most of the time, he returned home early and squatted by the stairs in front of the door to smoke, not daring to go in. Chapter 1947. His mind was in a mess these days. He remembered that when Weiwei Bai was with him 6 or 7 years ago, she was calm and indifferent. It seemed that nothing could move her. Sometimes, he didn't dare to give her expensive gifts because he was worried that she wouldn't like them. He could only put in a lot of effort into her food and clothes. Weiwei Bai definitely didn't know that the clothes she wore back then were handmade inch by a professional tailor using the most comfortable materials. He didn't expect her to find out. After all, at that time, he just wanted her to live a good life. He didn't want to take credit at all. Ordinary people couldn't buy the medicine and supplements that she used to nourish her body. He spent too much effort on it and got used to it. Xia Hanyang had a reason to say that he was cheap. Everyone would be moved by the effort he put in for her. But only she couldn't feel it. She didn't believe that he would always like her. Her outburst in the hospital that day pierced straight into his heart and made his bones hurt. He was stunned by her sudden anger. But after thinking about it carefully these days, he could roughly understand her feelings of not liking him. If he had nothing and someone suddenly loved him and wanted to give him support, he wouldn't want at all. Because other people's love and support were fragile and not worth mentioning to Xia Hanyang. His life was in his own hands. Maybe Weiwei Bai was like him, selfish and wanted to control her own life. Thinking of this, Xia Hanyang lit a cigarette and stared at it blankly. There was a trace of despair in his eyes amid the dense smoke. Did that mean that she would never like him? Because she was now trapped by him and had nothing, and was forced to rely on him. No one would like this kind of love. Xia Hanyang sneered at himself. But he didn't know what to do except to give her this kind of love. Just imagine letting her leave freely to pursue her own life. He felt cold all over. He was so scared that he couldn't control himself. 6 years ago, he let her go wherever she wanted. Now he didn't dare. Every time she went out, she might disappear. He lost her once and hurt himself in despair for 6 years. He had already gone crazy. He could only let her have a child and give them an extremely strong bond so that it would not be so easy for her to escape. Xia Hanyang regained his coldness and ruthlessness. He slowly put out the cigarette. Weiwei Bai said that she was not that beautiful. Wasn't he the same? The current him was so sick that even he was afraid of himself. Xia Hanyang got up and opened the door. The nanny was bending over to pour the medicine for Weiwei Bai. When she saw Xia Hanyang, she immediately nodded and said politely, "Young master." Xia Hanyang waved his hand and let the nanny leave. The nanny tacitly turned around to pack up, then quietly opened the door and left. The television was on. It was a landscape documentary. Weiwei Bai was half lying on the sofa, reading a book quietly and ignoring Xia Hanyang. But Xia Hanyang's heart was at ease. He had lived for 6 years just for this moment. As long as she was around, his passion for life would surge forth. Xia Hanyang kissed her gently, not daring to use too much strength. Wei Wei Bai was stunned for a moment before she turned to look at him. Xia Hanyang loosened his tie and picked up the bowl of medicine. Get up and drink, or I'll feed you. Wei Wei Bai frowned and took the bowl. Then she lowered her head and drank slowly. Her table manners were always quiet and slow, which was particularly pleasing to the eye. The so-called inferiority and selfishness in her mouth were not visible at all.
Tea.
Chapter 1948. Xia Hanyang sat aside and took off his coat. He was tall and looked good in everything. But she didn't look at him. She said he was good-looking. Xia Hanyang saw that she was gently sucking on the spoon. The light color of the medicinal soup made her lips moist a little more. His eyes widened at once. Maybe he was worse than a beast. Their relationship was broken, but he was still thinking about dirty things when he saw her. Xia Hanyang went to get the frozen mineral water and drank several mouthfuls to calm himself down. He used to look for her, but he didn't have the energy to think about it. Now that she was back, Xia Hanyang was such a mature man. He would become a woman if he didn't act on impulse. Moreover, he was very bad now and harbored evil intentions. He wanted to keep her for a lifetime. Anyway, their relationship was broken. It didn't matter if it was broken a little more. Xia Hanyang stood by the refrigerator and looked at Wei Wei Bai with deep eyes. Wei Wei Bai seemed to feel something. She drank the soup faster and then got up to take the bowl to the kitchen. Xia Hanyang immediately came and took her bowl away, not letting her touch the young Chun Shui. He came out of the kitchen, only to see that the door of the room was closed tightly. There was no one in the living room. Xia Hanyang couldn't help rubbing his face. His face was covered with wolf hair. Otherwise, how could she see his dirty thoughts? He was not in a hurry. He took a bottle of beer and drank some wine in this situation. He was too embarrassed to be so shameless. Xia Hanyang walked to the door, sat down, and drank the beer unhurriedly. Then he raised his voice and said, Wei Wei, it's still early. Are you going to bed? Wei Wei Bai was sullen and didn't speak. Xia Hanyang said, Do you want to come out and have a drink? I'll drink wine, and you can have some juice. Wei Wei Bai finally answered, No, I want to sleep. Xia Hanyang shook the beer can and said with a dangerous look in his eyes, Today, I attended Old Master's birthday party. Old Master's body can't take it anymore. He's going to die in the ICU. Before he dies, he's waiting for his grandson. But I have feelings for you. What do you think? The system rebutted. His grandfather has no problem living for 20 to 30 years. Don't listen to his nonsense. Bai Weiwei was full of admiration for his shamelessness. She was silent for a while before saying, I'm infertile. Xia Hanyang almost spat out the wine in his mouth. How could he retaliate like that? But who was he? He was a shameless man. He finished the beer in one gulp and threw the can into the trash can. He stood up and said, It's okay. I specialize in treating this. I'll treat you. Weiwei Bai immediately pushed the table, wanting to block the door and prevent the big bad wolf from entering. Unfortunately, the big wild wolf was very fast, and the table had not been pushed over yet. The door opened. Xia Hanyang smelled faintly of alcohol, and his eyes were shining like a wolf's. He looked at Weiwei Bai in a soft dress and smiled. Weiwei Bai's expression changed, and she stepped back. He followed her step by step. He seemed to be teasing her, but there was an indescribable seriousness in his actions. Do you like children? Why don't we have a child too? Weiwei Bai avoided him. I don't like it. Don't come over. Xia Hanyang smiled. How can you be sure that you don't like it before? Weiwei Bai retreated to the floor-to-ceiling window. She had nowhere else to go. She grabbed the curtain and hid half of her body behind it. Don't come over, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang saw that she was like a little white rabbit. He could see that her calmness had collapsed and she was panicking. Chapter 1949. Suddenly, he forgave her for her indifference. She was not really indifferent. As long as he forced himself on her, she would be scared to death. Although she wanted to show her little claws to scratch him. She was still weak. He was too lazy to hide his feelings. He was possessed. He liked everything about her. After 6 years of searching for her, he finally found her. He finally found her. He didn't want to torment himself anymore. He just wanted to be with her. Wei Wei, we've been apart for so long. Give me a hug as a gift. He didn't go up to grab her. Instead, he carefully lured her. This house was impenetrable. She couldn't hide anywhere. If he wanted to do whatever he wanted, she had nowhere to run. But Xia Hanyang knew that he couldn't do such a thing. It was not that he had high moral standards, but he didn't forget how her stepfather treated her. He didn't want to be on the same level as that beast in her heart. Wei Wei Bai stood behind the curtain. Her fingers were white as she pinched the curtain. She seemed to think that she was doomed. Her face was pure under the light. Her eyes were like a pool of water. Xia Hanyang's fingers stiffened. Her external arrogance was stripped away, revealing her fragile inner self. Only then did he know that she was so fragile. She was like a poor little girl who had been curled up pitifully in her heart. And he forced her to show such a pitiful side. Xia Hanyang also felt that his heart was broken into pieces.
He sighed.
He couldn't break her, but he also couldn't give her up. When it came to her, he was not a man. He was a woman. He took a few steps back, tried to suppress the evil in his heart, and said with difficulty, "It's late. Go to sleep." He slept in the guest room. He couldn't wait to sleep with her in his arms. He restrained this almost impossible to suppress thought. Xia Hanyang walked out with heavy steps. In fact, he wanted to go back to hold her and hug her. This thought kept rolling. He didn't know when he couldn't suppress it anymore. He really became the kind of lowly person that the old master said. Xia Hanyang's tall and straight figure slumped, looking indescribably bleak. When he walked to the door, he was even slower. He was so pitiful. She didn't know if she would take the bait. She wouldn't get pregnant even if she hugged him. Suddenly, he heard light footsteps behind him. His eyes lit up. He had been tricked. His footsteps stiffened as he waited. Hearing such a sincere request, he wondered if it was time to comfort him with love. After waiting for a few seconds, he could no longer maintain this posture. Xia Hanyang looked back, only to see Wei Wei Bai walking to the bed and reaching out to shake the quilt, as if she was going to sleep. When she saw him looking over, she froze. Aren't you going to sleep? Xia Hanyang. She did not pity him anymore. Sure enough, a woman who could leave for 6 years was extremely heartless. Xia Hanyang was aggrieved and rushed forward. His eyes were red. He suddenly turned around and rushed back. Sleep? I'm like a werewolf now. I'm hairy, and I want to eat people. He threw Wei Wei Bai onto the bed. Wei Wei Bai was stunned by this pounce. When she was about to struggle, Xia Hanyang had already rolled her up with a quilt. Then she was held in his arms like a mummy, unable to move. Wei Wei Bai poked her head out and shouted angrily, "Xia Hanyang, get off me." Xia Hanyang held the mummy in his arms and legs, and even had time to pull a pillow for her. There was only one pillow on the bed. She did not give him a chance at all. Xia Hanyang did not care. He squeezed himself onto the same pillow as Wei Wei Bai. His face pressed into her hair. Bai Wei Wei sucked in a breath of pain. Xia Hanyang quickly raised his face and reached out to gently grab her hair. Her hair was very long, like silk. He slowly tidied up her hair, took out a clean black and white checkered handkerchief from his trouser pocket, and tied her long hair. Wei Wei Bai stared at him warily. "If you move again, I can't guarantee your safety." Wei Wei Bai immediately dared not move. Xia Hanyang was also tired. He had been tormented by her these days, and his mind was full of her. With Wei Wei Bai around, he was 10 times busier than usual. He had to worry about all kinds of women's toys, clothes, food, and furnishings at home. This kind of worry was very reassuring. Xia Hanyang avoided the uncomfortable places where she breathed. He hugged her and slowly closed his eyes. After a long time, Wei Wei Bai thought that he had fallen asleep. Her body just relaxed. He suddenly said softly, "I miss you, Wei Wei." Wei Wei Bai was silent for a long time. She did not say anything, but her body did not resist his approach anymore. The night was silent. Since the two met, they finally had a gentle and quiet night together.
T.
Chapter 1950. It was not difficult for Wei Wei Bai to waste time with Xia Hanyang, because after he caught her, he didn't do anything to hurt her during the days when he hated her the most. She didn't have to worry that he would suddenly explode and drag her down with him. Therefore, she ate and drank as she pleased. She read books and played games on her phone that couldn't connect to the internet. Her days were simple and easy. For Wei Wei Bai, she was very satisfied with this kind of life, where she didn't need a strategy and didn't have to worry about whether she would have food tomorrow. Therefore, although her attitude towards Xia Hanyang was not very good, she didn't provoke him either. After the last time Xia Hanyang stayed in her bed, he always found an opportunity to hug her to sleep. Wei Wei Bai struggled a few times and let Xia Hanyang be like this. After all, she still maintained a deceptive character who didn't like to rely on others. If she suddenly became enthusiastic towards Xia Hanyang would think that she was going to run away. Under the nourishment of this relaxed life, she gained 3 kilograms. But after more than a month, anyone would be tired of it. If she had a date to go back, she could just endure it. The problem was that she was forced to stay in this world for a lifetime. Therefore, after more than a month of idling, she finally thought of doing something to solve the knot in Xia Hanyang's heart. 6 years, plus the obsession of self-harm and suicide. Xia Hanyang could really lock her up for a lifetime. After seeing so many perverts, Wei Wei Bai was not surprised by Xia Hanyang. She even thought that Xia Hanyang was very gentle. She said that he had grown up. She said that he had grown from a little mutt to a big husky. She didn't mean that he had really grown into a wolf. So Wei Wei Bai picked and finally discussed with the system. How about I have depression? The system was a little busy recently because it was too idle, so it took some work to support itself and the host. It was knitting some sweaters, hats, bracelets, or hair ornaments. If he did these things, he would be able to gain 6 to 7 days of HP every month. He was simply too idle, and he was worried about leaving his host, so he could only accept this kind of work. As soon as he heard that his host was going to cause trouble again, he said earnestly, "Can't you just live a good life? Depression, car accidents, leukemia, suicide, and so on. You've been watching too many Korean dramas. You should read more men's web novels. I guarantee that you'll be optimistic and full of enthusiasm." Wei Wei Bai, is it an illusion? The system had been acting like a housewife recently. Wei Wei Bai continued to pick and choose. She felt that other diseases were more troublesome. Or was it a mental patient? It was normal for people to have problems after being locked up for a long time. Moreover, she was familiar with depression. She had suffered from it a few times. Wei Wei Bai, I also want to live a good life, but I can't be locked up forever. If I don't torment Xia Hanyang, I won't even have the fun of shopping online. So be it. Not having Wi-Fi was killing her. She had endured it for more than a month. If she endured it any longer, she would have to climb out of the window and connect to the internet cable next door. So Wei Wei Bai patted her face and said lazily, "Time to work." If she continued to be lazy, she would become useless. Xia Hanyang was really good at raising people. He raised her until her limbs were not working hard. Even if she was lucky enough to escape in the future, she would not be able to support herself. Maybe it was his idea. What a vicious little wolf. Depression was not something that could come easily. She began to slowly reduce the amount of food she ate. She stayed at home every day and did not exercise much. Eating less was not a burden. T crossover system. Prince Charming, come here. Chapter 1951. Xia Hanyang was very sensitive. He found out when she began to lose appetite. But he thought that she had eaten too many tonics and began to resist. After all, there were too many medicinal soups. He was also anxious and hoped that she could recover quickly. The old Chinese medicine doctor's words really scared him. He wouldn't be able to put his heart at ease if he didn't take care of his short-lived foundation. For many days, she ate less and less. Even the nanny couldn't help but tell him. Xia Hanyang became more and more uneasy. He went home early before dinner. As soon as he entered the door, he saw the nanny cleaning the table. She didn't eat much. Wei Bai looked weak. She looked at the table blankly, with tiredness in her calmness. Her appearance shocked him. He had been so happy these days that she sometimes didn't pay much attention when she was in a trance. Years of accumulated uneasiness and pain were soothed because of her return. As a result, Xia Hanyang didn't think about what his happiness meant to Wei Bai. "Little master, you're back." The nanny immediately shouted when she saw him come back. Wei Bai's eyes returned to normal, and she looked at him indifferently. The tiredness just now was gone. It seemed to be an illusion. Xia Hanyang felt uneasy, but he suppressed it and said, "I didn't eat. Set the table again." The nanny immediately nodded and went to the kitchen to set the table again. Wei Bai had got up and was about to leave the table. However, Xia Hanyang walked over and pressed her down again. He said with a cold face, "Eat with me." Wei Bai said, "I'm full." Xia Hanyang's face darkened. He said stubbornly, "Eat with me more." His tone brooked no refusal. Wei Bai didn't resist, but sat down obediently. Then she said listlessly, "Okay." This attitude was very abnormal. Wei Bai was very cold and arrogant. She was angry because she was locked up by him, so she didn't like him. Sometimes she couldn't resist what he said and would despise him with her eyes. But just now she didn't. Her eyes were like a wasteland, and he couldn't see any emotion. The uneasiness in Xia Hanyang's heart became more intense. The dishes were served again. There were 2 new dishes and a soup. Together with the dishes that Wei Bai had never eaten before, it looked exceptionally delicious. However, Wei Bai couldn't be bothered to look at it. As long as one was alive, one would have an appetite. If one had an appetite, one would be obsessed with good food. The nanny was able to serve his parents and him for so many years. Other things aside, her culinary skills were outstanding. She hadn't eaten much for several days. A normal person would definitely be hungry and wouldn't turn a blind eye to a table full of dishes. At first, he thought that she was threatening his freedom by not eating. However, she had no such intention at all. It was as if she had no interest in food at all. Xia Hanyang picked up his chopsticks and put some of her favorite dishes into her bowl. "Eat some more, Wei." Wei Bai lazily looked up at him. The tiredness in her eyes was light, but it was impossible to ignore. She slowly picked up her chopsticks and ate the food. There was no sign of resistance. Xia Hanyang heaved a sigh of relief. As long as she was willing to eat, it was fine. He wasn't stupid. He had locked her up for almost 2 months and barely allowed her to go out. The insecurity in his heart made him morbidly want her to stay in the house, so that she wouldn't disappear. However, a normal person would have problems sooner or later if they were locked up like this. Chapter 1952. Xia Hanyang didn't eat much himself, but he tried his best to pick up food for her. He estimated her appetite and planned to feed her. But before he could pick up half of her food, Wei Bai's face changed. She threw down her chopsticks and rushed into the bathroom. Xia Hanyang panicked and hurried to follow her. After Wei Bai vomited all the food, Xia Hanyang rushed over and wanted to pat her back. But she frowned, pushed his hand away, and then went to rinse her mouth and wash her face. Seeing her like this, Xia Hanyang's uneasiness turned into a sharp blade, cutting his heart. He hurriedly asked, "What's wrong?" Wei Bai turned back and said calmly, "Nothing. I just don't want to eat. I ate too much and want to vomit." Xia Hanyang was not so easy to fool. While Wei Bai was still in a daze, he picked her up and walked out. "Go to the hospital." Wei Bai suddenly frowned in disgust. "I don't want to go." Xia Hanyang was frightened by her state. She was so strong that it was terrible. "It's not up to you." Wei Bai grabbed his clothes and gasped, "Xia Hanyang, do you know that you are really sick? You locked me up for so long and took me to the hospital as soon as you went out." "I'm fine." Xia Hanyang had already gotten in the car. He pressed her to the passenger seat and fastened her seat belt. He sneered, "You're fine. You eat until you vomit? The doctor has the final say." Wei Wei Bai resisted for a while, but was finally dragged to the hospital by Xia Hanyang for a physical examination. The final result was that there was nothing wrong with her. It was just that her stomach was weak and she had indigestion. Xia Hanyang asked the doctor closely. The doctor answered carefully, "Maybe it's because of her mood and lack of exercise." Lack of exercise was a problem. Mood? Xia Hanyang looked back at Wei Wei Bai, who was sitting in the chair. She looked at the nurses who came and went with a blank expression. Her expression was distant and calm. She seemed to be isolated from the people around her, as if she was sitting in another world. She had no appetite and rarely exercised. Recently, she had also been sleepy. Moreover, she didn't seem to be interested in anything. According to the nanny, she hadn't been reading or playing games recently. He liked to be in a daze. He thought that locking her up for a few years would cause her to develop mental problems. At that time, they had already been together for a few years. She definitely couldn't run away. After all, a few years was enough for him to raise her until she didn't know anything about the world and had no ability to survive. She was not even allowed to interact with the internet in such an era of information technology. A few years later, she didn't even know how to get a ride when she went out. At that time, he would be able to take her out of the house without worry. He did not deny that his thoughts were indeed vicious. But he didn't want to live another 6 years without her. Xia Hanyang walked up to her with a heavy heart. However, he saw her staring blankly at the wall not far away, as if she didn't see him. This was not normal. Xia Hanyang couldn't help asking, "What are you looking at, Wei Wei?" Wei Wei Bai suddenly woke up and looked up at him. Her eyes were still blank. "Nothing." Then she stood up. "Are you done? Can we go back now?" Xia Hanyang looked at her blankly for a while and suddenly said, "I'll go to the bathroom and come back later." Wei Wei Bai nodded indifferently. Xia Hanyang slowly moved away. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment and then walked out. He didn't go anywhere, and he was leaning against the wall. If it was the Wei Wei Bai of the past, she would definitely run away. There was no one guarding her. However, he waited for a full 10 minutes and still didn't see her run away. Crossover system. My idol, come here. Crossover system. My idol, come here. / crossover system. My idol, come here. Crossover system. My idol, come here. Button crossover system. My idol, come here. Chapter 1953. Xia Hanyang walked back with heavy steps and saw that Wei Wei Bai was still sitting in the chair. Her posture and expression had not changed. She had not run away and had been waiting for him. Xia Hanyang had been forced to see a psychiatrist so many times that he was very familiar with this place. Then, it was his turn to force Wei Wei Bai to see a psychiatrist. The results were not surprising. Mild depression had already shown signs of metastasizing to moderate depression. At first, she was just not interested in anything and liked to sleep and not eat. In the future, when her depression was serious, she would have the impulse to commit suicide. Xia Hanyang was familiar with this and knew what was going on with Wei Wei Bai without even looking at it. Did she really hate him so much? He had only locked her up for 2 months, and she was already depressed. He took the test results and walked out of the door blankly, only to see Wei Wei Bai sitting quietly. Her thin shadow was elongated on the ground, and her side face was pale and bloodless. After such a long time, she did not look healthy at all. Xia Hanyang was in a mess, but he calmed down at this moment. He was unwilling to let go of her. But locking her up like this would cause her to commit suicide slowly. The doctor also said that her current character was caused by the huge trauma in her childhood. Her parents died, and she lived in poverty. She had never had a day of peace. Her life was full of all kinds of painful and gloomy experiences. She also met him now, who was thinking of ways to control her life and not giving her a chance to escape. How could he not know that this was wrong? But he did not dare to let go. Xia Hanyang came to her with a glimmer of hope. "Let's go home, Wei Wei." Wei Wei Bai did not respond, but she still got up and followed him. She looked as if she did not care about anything. Xia Hanyang's heart was tight and uncomfortable. He reached out and grabbed her arm, looking at her deeply. Suddenly, he asked softly, if I let you go out, will you come back? She had a knot in her heart, not only because he locked her up. The doctor's words echoed in his mind for a long time. Apart from her childhood, she was so easily depressed because she had not lived well in the past few years. That was why she felt more desperate about life. Where had she been for the past 6 years? For the first time, Xia Hanyang wanted to flip through this document. Wei Wei Bai paused and looked back at him strangely. Suddenly she sneered. Xia Hanyang, I think you are very strange. With your current status, you can get any woman you want. Why do you insist on me?
What's so good about me?
You're so persistent in running around for me, worrying about me. Aren't you afraid that when you think about it in the future, you'll feel that it's not worth it to sacrifice for a woman like me? Xia Hanyang frowned, knowing that she was emotionally unstable. This is a common symptom of depression. He said patiently, I don't think it's not worth it to you. I never will. Wei Wei Bai, there is no such thing as forever. Do you think forever is short? You're just unwilling to give up now. You're young and you can't get it. That's why you're holding on to me so tightly. Xia Hanyang looked at her frighteningly cold eyes. His blood rushed his head, and he felt that his kindness had been regarded as ill intent. He said in a trembling voice, I'm unwilling to give up. Would I commit suicide because I'm unwilling to give up? When I jumped into the sea with the car, I didn't want to live anymore. If I was really unwilling to give up, I would have killed you the first time I saw you, instead of doting on you like you're my ancestor. Wei Wei Bai was stunned, and a trace of disbelief appeared in her eyes. Suicide. Download the at https://m/sashu.com. Chapter 1954. Xia Hanyang stiffened his neck and wanted to slap himself for saying such a shameful thing. He immediately said, No, it's nonsense. Don't say that you're unwilling or unworthy in the future. I won't listen. After saying that, he still felt ashamed that a man would commit suicide to get his woman back. Even a good-for-nothing wouldn't do that. Xia Hanyang was about to leave angrily. Her hands were like willow branches in spring, gently hugging his waist. Her strength was very light. As long as Xia Hanyang took a step forward, he would break away from this hug. She was so careful that she could let go of him at any time. Xia Hanyang didn't dare to take a step forward. She didn't press her body against his and just hugged his waist lightly. What's the matter with jumping into the sea? Her voice was suppressed and a little hesitant. Xia Hanyang really didn't want to talk about the past. He regretted jumping into the sea and not dying. Because if he was disabled, how could he find Wei Wei Bai in the future? If he found her, Wei Wei Bai would probably dislike him. Now, she would even dislike him if he was all right. Xia Hanyang was silent for a while before saying, At that time, I was in a hurry to find you and accidentally drove into the sea. It was an accident, not a suicide. In fact, he was already desperate.
So he thought that it was better to die.
It was meaningless to live like this. Of course, he wouldn't say such useless thoughts. Wei Wei Bai seemed to take a deep breath, and her fingertips were trembling badly. Her voice was suppressed and hoarse, as if she said inadvertently, I thought that after you knew that I didn't like you and left you for 10 million yuan, you would dump me and live your own life. Xia Hanyang's mouth twitched, and he was about to sneer at her. How could he dump her? She was the one who dumped him. Huh? No. Why did this sound so strange? How could she be sure that after the old man gave her 10 million yuan? How could he know that she took the money and left? At first, he just thought that she was missing and killed. He was so neurotic that he was looking for murderers or kidnappers. It wasn't unreasonable for him to think so, because they offended a criminal gang. The gang was buried alive, who knew if there were any accomplices who hadn't been caught. If his grandfather hadn't shown him the surveillance video to save him, he didn't know that she took the money and kicked him away. And that year, there was some secret about the surveillance video in the living room. If Bai Weiwei was really as selfish as she said, would she ignore this detail? Doubts flashed in Xia Hanyang's mind. He suddenly asked softly, Back then, did you deliberately put on an act for my grandfather? No, to be precise, it was for him. Bai Weiwei's hand shook. She suddenly released him and immediately retreated. And not Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang suddenly turned around, his eyes bursting with unimaginable fierceness.
He approached him step by step.
You know that there are surveillance cameras. If you really only want money, you wouldn't have suddenly turned against me like this. Aren't you afraid that I'll take revenge on you? To you, too.
And
then her actions wouldn't work at all. She knew how vengeful he was. Even if she took the money, she wouldn't say such harsh words. She was such a smart person. It would be easy for her to get 10 million yuan from him. How could she be so decisive and trample on his heart? She just left. Chapter 1955. Weiwei Bai panicked for a moment, but she soon calmed down. She said coldly, "You think too much, Xia Hanyang. Don't beautify my behavior. I'm never as beautiful as you think." Her face was terribly pale, and her eyes were trembling. It seemed that this topic made her very uncomfortable. Xia Hanyang wanted to continue to ask, but thinking of her unstable mood, he immediately stopped his impulse. He immediately showed a smile. Beautify? You're wrong. You've always been beautiful in my eyes. Beautify was a self-deceiving word, and her beauty was real. Weiwei Bai was silent for a long time and finally sighed and said helplessly, "Don't you think it's irrational? Whether it was the accident of jumping into the sea or looking for me for so many years, one day you will regret doing so much for me." Xia Hanyang sneered. "I only know that I've been living a life worse than death for the past 6 years. No matter how much I regret it, it won't be worse than these 6 years." His blood was aroused, and his whole body was furious. His eyes were filled with ruthlessness and madness that burned with reckless abandon. It even had an infatuation that made people tremble. Weiwei Bai was frightened by his eyes and stepped back a few steps. She seemed to be at a loss and felt that he was unreasonable. Xia Hanyang was stung by the subtle panic in her eyes, and he immediately sobered up. He couldn't control himself again when he shouted at a depressed person. 6 years was enough to turn his irritable temperament into a cruel and cold madman. Weiwei Bai suddenly whispered to herself, "Xia Hanyang, I'm really not worth your self-abuse." When she spoke, her thick eyelashes shone with fine light. Her beautiful eyes were a lot lighter, as if they were filled with water vapor, making them look moist. She was beautiful and pitiful. Xia Hanyang felt that he was blind before. Why did he always think that she was cold and arrogant and unapproachable? She obviously had a cold and arrogant shell, but in fact, she was very soft. He remembered that when he took her paper for the first time, she looked at him so pitifully. At that time, his heart was hooked. He obviously hated this little pitiful girl. But surprisingly, he didn't reject it that much in his heart. Otherwise, he wouldn't have dragged her onto the cruise. It was as if he wanted to show off his amusement park and broaden her horizons. After thinking about it, wasn't he an idiot? He was obviously seduced by her, but he was still holding on to his pride. Xia Hanyang stared straight at her without blinking. Weiwei Bai took a few steps back from his stare. Only then did he realize that the green light in his eyes had appeared. He had been very angry recently, and he couldn't find a way to vent it. Weiwei Bai should be softer and more pitiful. His mind was filled with nonsense. He didn't care how self-deprecating she was. Depression was like that, self-pitying and lamenting. Xia Hanyang didn't care about her resistance. He reached out to hold her face and looked at her carefully. He wished he could put his feelings into her heart. Just by looking at her face, that beautiful feeling was enough to drown him. Her eyes were his cage, locking him in. He wanted nothing more than to cling to the cage and not come out. Xia Hanyang's tone was terrifyingly serious. It was no different from going to the battlefield. Weiwei Bai, listen to me. It's not up to you to decide whether it's worth it or not.
You're not me.
Don't make decisions for me. After he finished speaking, he felt that his tone was too harsh. How could it not be harsh? He would also feel wronged if he had to deal with such a troublemaker like Weiwei Bai.
Button.
Chapter 1956. But what could he do? He could only wait and love her. He had already dug out his heart, but she was still finding trouble for him. Whether it was worth it or not, or whether he would regret it. He had long regretted meeting her. As long as he could not see her, everything would go smoothly for him. Ever since he met her, he had always been unlucky. He had never had a day of peace. What was he after? To regret it in the future, and then abandon her? He must be sick in the head. Wasn't it because he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her? That was why he was so desperate. His gaze was burning, and his eyes were bright and dark. What do I do to make you believe me and like me? You can't be so selfish. Why don't you think about how much I've sacrificed for you when you think about being abandoned? He was a man, but he was trampling on his pride. He was so petty that he would fuss over such trivial matters. He had no self-esteem left. He thought that he could keep quiet. After all, he was a man and it was okay to give more. But this was not a matter of giving more. This was a matter of life and death. Anyway, he had no face in front of Wei Bai. He was even more shameless. He wanted to collect his debt from her for the rest of his life. Why could she turn a blind eye to him when he had sacrificed so much? It was too unfair. He was more resentful than Do-yi. He wished he could call someone to make artificial snow for Wei Bai to see. Xia Hanyang did not care about his image. When we met, I stayed up late to study every day for you. You know that, right? At that time, I had a net worth of hundreds of millions. I earned it all by myself. I abandoned my business for that damn college entrance exam that was useless to me. I was like a kitten meowing at you every day. I lost hundreds of millions every month just to study intersection and union function formulas. You have to admit it. Wei Bai moved her lips and said with some difficulty, I didn't know you lost so much. Xia Hanyang sneered. What do you know? You only know how to stab me in the heart. You only think about when I'm dead and stop pestering you. These words were too harsh. Wei Bai couldn't take it anymore. The corners of her eyes turned red, and her face was pale. She was so beautiful that Xia Hanyang's heart kept twitching. He didn't want to force her like this. Wouldn't he feel bad if she was in pain? It was unbearable. But she was already depressed. If he didn't get to the main point, she would be able to undo the knot in her heart. If her depression continued to worsen, would she be able to recover? Wasn't this forcing him to his death? The two of them might as well perish together. Xia Hanyang thought fiercely and continued to say in a more serious tone, You don't have to give me anything, but you feel good because no one can hurt you. You'd rather die than give me your heart. As for me, I've dug out my heart and lungs. I'm just short of holding a knife and begging you to stab me to death. Don't hang me up and torture me like this. My entire youth was buried in your hands. You left just because you said so. If you had any dissatisfaction with me at that time, why did you leave? Tell me. I can't eat, and someone forced water down my throat. Do you know how to force water down my throat? Holding that kind of funnel-like tool and forcefully pouring it down. Wei Bai finally couldn't stand it anymore. She shouted angrily, Enough, stop talking. Xia Hanyang sneered. Do you feel sorry for me too? I lost dozens of kilograms in a month. Why didn't you feel sorry for me at that time? Wei Bai was a little exhausted. Her vision turned black, and her arms were terrifyingly cold. She repeated with trembling lips, almost pleading, Stop talking, Xia Hanyang. Download the at https://m/com/. Chapter 1957. Xia Hanyang couldn't suppress his outburst. She didn't want to live a good life with him. What else could he do? Depression was very destructive. She hated him so much that she even suffered from depression when she stayed by his side. Xia Hanyang's heart was broken by her. He pinched her arms hard to prevent her from escaping. He stared at her frightened eyes. I have to say it. I have to let you know that I've lived a life worse than a dog. After all, she was superior because of him. He was rich and powerful, handsome, and had countless ways to retreat. That was why she didn't like him. What could he do? Disfigure his face or destroy his future to love her? At that time, she would definitely despise him. Thinking about it this way, she was really selfish, pretentious, and scum to the core. She didn't give anything because she was afraid of getting hurt. However, Xia Hanyang didn't care how vicious, selfish, and cruel she was. As long as she didn't run away, she could live a peaceful life with him. She didn't even fulfill such a simple wish, so he didn't pretend to be gentle with her. Xia Hanyang's expression was so ruthless that it was close to cruelty. Do you know that I've been looking for you every day for the past 6 years? I fucking went to the furthest and most dangerous places to find you. I got into trouble because of you and was almost chopped up. Because it was too painful to think of you, I drank too much and almost got myself sent to the morgue because of alcohol poisoning. I've also suffered from depression. I'm much worse than you. I stabbed myself in the neck with a knife and wished that I could die to be free. I even jumped into the sea. What accident? I did it on purpose. He didn't want his face anymore. He didn't want his self-esteem anymore. She didn't want to live anymore. She wanted him dead. Then what face did he want? Xia Hanyang said word by word, full of hatred. Wei Bai, touch your conscience and tell me, how can I have a way out? I've died countless times. Where is my way out? Wei Bai's eyes were misty, but they were no longer cold and arrogant. Instead, after the layer of indifference was shattered, she revealed helpless pain. She finally spoke in a trembling voice. I didn't know. I didn't know you were in so much pain, Xia Hanyang. She seemed to be remorseful and desperate. Why do you have to force yourself like this? I'm not worth it. I'm not worth it at all. Xia Hanyang suddenly showed a tired smile, and his fingers slowly touched her delicate and beautiful face. When he saw her, he really wanted to say something. She had also grown up. What used to be a crisp plum had now grown into a delicate and beautiful flower. The first time they met after reuniting, he smashed the door open. Her ink-black hair fell to her shoulders, and her flawless face that was whiter than snow rushed into his eyes. How beautiful. You see, after being hurt by her for so many years, the first time they met, he was still stunned by her. He loved her so much. What could he do? He was also in despair. What's the use of despising yourself when you love someone so lowly? Didn't he continue to kneel and love her? Xia Hanyang's fingers touched the redness at the corner of her eyes, which was wet. Her eyes were filled with tears. He didn't know if it was because she was scared by him or because she was hurt. He suddenly felt that he was really a jerk. It was all in the past, and he still used it to scare her. At the end of the day, he was the one who did all these shameless things. It had nothing to do with her. Look at how he had forced her to this point with these trivial matters. Xia Hanyang revealed a bitter smile, and his voice softened. Wei, you are my only way out, do you understand? There were countless ways out, and they didn't exist. With that said, he let go of her arm. Chapter 1958. He knew that he was hurting her. It was good to explode once. Otherwise, he would really hurt her when he became completely perverted. He would regret it for the rest of his life. Xia Hanyang felt that he looked ugly. He reached out to cover his face in embarrassment, worried that his tears would burst out. He hurriedly turned around, wanting to leave for a while to calm down. But before he could take 2 steps, the back of his clothes was suddenly pulled. Xia Hanyang paused. He heard Wei Bai muster all her courage and say, Back then, I liked you, Xia Hanyang. Xia Hanyang's tinnitus was severe. He felt that he was seriously ill. His ears were hallucinating. Her voice was still choked with panic, but more of it was hoarse because she was desperate. At that time, I started to like you, so I wanted to leave you. Xia Hanyang was stunned. He stood there stiffly, not even daring to look back. Along the way, his love had been too petty and painful. His greatest hope was that she would stay by his side calmly and occasionally give him an emotionless smile.
He was happy.
Wei Bai should never be the one feeling inferior in this relationship. It should be him. Xia Hanyang's fingertips began to numb and tremble with excitement. He said in a hoarse voice, "Don't talk nonsense, because of sympathy." If he took it seriously, it would really be over. If she didn't give him hope, he would have nothing to ask for from her. As long as there was a slight possibility that she loved him, his appetite would be like a black hole, eager to devour her. Wei Wei Bai's fingers pinched the corner of his clothes. Her fingernails turned white, and she slowly pressed her head against his back. Every word was light and solemn. "Xia Hanyang, I liked you. At that time, I was scared." She almost cried as she said, "I didn't dare to imagine how I could be with you when I had nothing. I had no choice but to leave." 6 years ago, she was just a few years old. But she was still young. Xia Hanyang now thought about it and knew that they were at that time. They were both equally childish. He loved her wholeheartedly. But he didn't even understand her uneasiness, inferiority, and pain. No wonder people said that first love didn't die a good death. He was a son of a B****starred, and his love was rough and careless. How could it be so easy to end things well? Serves him right for looking for her for 6 years. Xia Hanyang said in a husky voice, "Don't lie to me." Wei Wei Bai started crying softly. Her tears stained his back. "I can't lie to you. I really don't dare to lie to you, Xia Hanyang. So don't hurt yourself like this." Her words were soft and sad, but there was an unwavering determination. Xia Hanyang stared blankly ahead. This dream was so beautiful. How many times had he woken up in the middle of the night to look for her? He was also worried that Wei Wei Bai would suddenly appear and say that she was joking with him. She liked him so much. His dream had come true. However, he suddenly had no reaction at all. Only the sound of her crying rang in his ears. She cried so hard that even a man like him wanted to cry. Xia Hanyang turned around, pressed her lowered head with one hand, and pressed her face against his chest. His other hand also wrapped around her waist. Then he rested his head on her neck, breathing in her fresh and fragile breath. He murmured, "Then, do you still like me now?" Wei Wei Bai didn't say anything, but her tears didn't stop. She was silent, and her crying made him feel terrible. Xia Hanyang couldn't help but beg for mercy. "It's okay if you don't like me. It's okay if you don't like me. Just don't cry." He couldn't stand this trick of hers. Suddenly he paused. He felt a thin layer of clothing on his chest. Her kiss and cold tears were imprinted on his chest. It was a very heavy kiss. Imprinted on his chest, he lost all words. But he heard her whisper, "I like you." Xia Hanyang. Ding. The male lead's favorability is at 97. The download address is at https://www.
Sashu.com.
You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.